Two rival alphas. One cursed bloodline. A love that could destroy them both. When the Shadowcrest and Ironridge packs collide over ancient hunting grounds, Seraphina Blackthorn and Kieran Steelclaw become prisoners of a vendetta that spans generations. She's the fierce daughter of a fallen alpha, determined to reclaim her birthright. He's the ruthless leader who conquered her territory and refuses to yield an inch. But when a blood moon rises and an ancient curse threatens to consume them both, these sworn enemies must choose between the hatred that defines them or a passion that could save or damn them forever. Ready for a battle of hearts that will leave you breathless? Hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Do you think enemies can truly become lovers when blood has been spilled between their packs? Subscribe for more shifter romance that will make your heart race. Chapter 1. The Scent of War. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like a shroud, but nothing could mask the scent of trespass that burned through Seraphina Blackthorn's nostrils. Her wolf snarled beneath her skin, recognizing the bold, masculine aroma that had haunted her nightmares for 3 long years: cedar and steel, dominance and cruelty, wrapped in the unmistakable signature of the bastard who'd stolen everything from her.
Kieran Steelclaw.
Sarah crouched behind a fallen log, her heart hammering as she watched the Ironridge patrol marking trees that had belonged to her family for over 2 centuries. 6 wolves moved through her father's sacred grove with the casual arrogance of conquerors, their alphas scent coating every branch like a declaration of ownership. Not anymore, she thought, her canines extending involuntarily. Today, the Shadowcrest pack reclaims what's ours. The largest of the intruders lifted his head, nostrils flaring. Even in human form, Kieran moved with predatory grace, his dark hair catching the dappled sunlight as he turned slowly in her direction. Sarah held her breath, pressing herself lower against the mossy earth. 3 years of guerrilla warfare had taught her patience, but being this close to her enemy sent fire racing through her veins. She'd been barely 19 when he'd challenged her father for these lands, too young to understand the politics, too naive to see the betrayal coming. Marcus Blackthorn had ruled the Shadowcrest territory with wisdom and strength for 30 years. He should have crushed the upstart alpha from the northern mountains. Instead, he died with Kieran's claws in his throat. Something's wrong. Kieran's deep voice rumbled through the forest, sending unwanted shivers down Sarah's spine. Even after all this time, the sound of him speaking made her wolf respond in ways she refused to acknowledge. The scent patterns are off. His lieutenant, a scarred brute named Garrett, stepped closer. Just marking violations again, Alpha. Those Shadowcrest survivors keep trying to. It's not marking. Kieran's amber eyes swept the treeline with laser focus. Someone's watching us. Someone who doesn't belong here. Sarah's pulse spiked. In 3 years of hidden-run attacks, she'd never been detected. But something felt different today. The air itself seemed charged with electricity, as if the forest was holding its breath. Her skin prickled with awareness, every nerve ending hypersensitive to the massive male presence just yards away. Without warning, Kieran's head snapped toward her hiding spot. Their eyes locked through the screen of vegetation, amber meeting violet in a collision that sent shockwaves through her entire system. For one suspended moment, the world narrowed to that burning gaze, intelligent, dangerous, and far too knowing. Then he smiled, and it was like staring into the face of a beautiful predator. Found you. Sarah exploded from cover, her partial shift rippling through her as claws extended and supernatural speed carried her up the nearest pine. Bark shredded under her grip as she scrambled toward the canopy, Kieran's roar of pursuit echoing behind her. She'd planned this escape route a dozen times, knew every branch and gap in the forest crown. What she hadn't planned for was Kieran's inhuman speed. He hit the tree trunk seconds after her, his full wolf form flowing up the bark like liquid shadow. Sarah risked a glance down and immediately regretted it. His shifted form was magnificent and terrifying, jet black fur gleaming over muscles built for killing, yellow eyes locked on her with single-minded intensity. She leaped to the next tree, then the next, using momentum and desperation to stay ahead of her pursuer. The branch beneath her feet cracked ominously. Sarah's heart lurched as she felt it begin to give way, her claws scrambling for purchase on the smooth bark. For one terrifying moment, she teetered on the edge of a 40-foot fall. Then impossibly strong arms wrapped around her waist, jerking her against a solid chest as Kieran hauled them both to safety on a thicker branch. Sarah found herself pressed against her enemy's body, his human form radiating heat and raw power. His scent enveloped her, that maddening combination of cedar and steel that made her wolf whimper with confused longing. She could feel his heart beating against her back, steady and strong, while her own hammered like a trapped bird. "Easy," Kieran murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "I've got you." The gentleness in his voice was more shocking than any violence could have been. Sarah twisted in his arms, amber eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. This close, she could see the thin scar along his jawline, the laugh lines that spoke of joy she'd never witnessed, the way his pupils dilated as he took in her scent. "Let me go," she whispered, hating how breathless she sounded. Instead of compliance, his arms tightened fractionally. "Why are you here, Sarah?" Hearing her name on his lips sent another unwanted thrill through her. She forced steel into her voice, calling on every lesson in pack authority her father had taught her. "These are Shadowcrest lands. I don't need a reason to be in my own territory." Something flickered in Kieran's expression. Regret? Pain? It was gone too quickly to identify. "Your territory was forfeit 3 years ago. Your father's challenge." "My father's murder," Sarah snarled, her partial shift rippling through her again. Claws pressed against Kieran's chest, drawing tiny beads of blood. "Don't you dare call it anything else." For a moment, something raw and vulnerable flashed in his eyes. Then his expression hardened back into the mask of the conquering Alpha. "A challenge fought and won according to pack law. Your father knew the stakes when he accepted. He accepted because you threatened to slaughter every Shadowcrest pup if he didn't." The words tore from her throat, carrying 3 years of pain and rage. "You backed him into a corner and then killed him for sport." Kieran went perfectly still. When he spoke, his voice was soft and deadly. "Is that what you believe?" "I know what I saw." Sarah's violet eyes blazed with fury. "I was there, Kieran. I watched you tear out his throat while he begged for mercy that never came." Something shifted in the air between them, a tension that had nothing to do with their precarious position in the tree and everything to do with the weight of unspoken truths. Kieran's thumb traced along her jawline, the gesture so unexpected and gentle that Sarah's breath caught. "You saw what you needed to see," he said quietly. "What everyone needed to see." Before Sarah could process that cryptic statement, shouts erupted from below. Garrett's voice carried clearly through the forest. "Alpha. Border Patrol reports Shadowcrest movement on the eastern ridge." Looks like this was a distraction. Kieran's attention snapped away from her, his protective instincts clearly at war with his duty to his pack. In that moment of inattention, Sarah acted. She twisted out of his arms and dropped to a lower branch, her supernatural agility carrying her toward the ground in a controlled fall. She expected pursuit, expected to feel his hands grabbing for her again. Instead, she landed alone on the forest floor, her enemy still perched above like some dark guardian angel. "This isn't over," Kieran called down, his voice carrying a promise that made her shiver. Sarah looked up one last time, memorizing the sight of him framed against the green canopy, beautiful and dangerous and utterly forbidden. "No," she agreed softly. "It's not." Then she melted into the forest shadows, leaving only her scent behind to torment the Alpha who'd stolen everything from her. But as she ran toward the rallying point where her own pack waited, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of Kieran's touch or the strange pain in his eyes when she'd spoken of her father's death. What everyone needed to see. What had he meant by that? And why did her wolf keep insisting that the scent surrounding him hadn't been triumph or cruelty, but something far more complex and far more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart? The questions chased her through the forest, as persistent and troubling as the man she was running from. Chapter 2. The Alpha's Burden. Kieran remained in the tree long after Seraphina's scent faded, his hands gripping the rough bark as he fought the urge to follow her into the shadows. 3 years. 3 years of glimpses and near misses, of tracking her guerrilla attacks and finding only empty forests in her wake. But today, for those few precious moments, she'd been real and warm and furious in his arms. And she still believed he was a monster. Alpha. Garrett's voice carried up from below, tinged with the careful neutrality his lieutenant used when he suspected his leader was making questionable decisions. Should we pursue? Kieran dropped to the ground in one fluid motion, landing beside his beta with practiced ease. The other Iron Ridge wolves had formed a protective circle, their postures alert and ready for battle. Good soldiers, all of them. They'd follow him into hell if he asked, and sometimes he wondered if that's exactly where he was leading them. No pursuit, he said, his voice carrying the authority that brooked no argument. We have more pressing concerns. Garrett's scarred face twisted with frustration. Sir, she's been sabotaging our operations for months. The pack is starting to question. The pack questions nothing that doesn't concern them. Kieran cut him off, amber eyes flashing with warning. And Seraphina Blackthorn is my concern alone. The words carried more weight than he'd intended, and Kieran saw the way his men exchanged glances. Pack politics were treacherous waters, and even the hint of personal involvement with an enemy could be seen as weakness. But how could he explain that every night for 3 years, he dreamed of violet eyes full of hatred? How could he tell them that Marcus Blackthorn's dying words haunted him more than any ghost? Protect her, whatever the cost. The Eastern Ridge situation? Kieran asked, forcing his attention back to immediate threats. Garrett fell into step beside him as they headed deeper into the territory. 3 vehicles spotted near the old mining road. Could be Shadowcrest, could be something else. Marcus always kept that sector locked down tight, never understood why until now.
Kieran did.
The Eastern Ridge held secrets that went far deeper than territorial disputes, secrets that Marcus had died protecting. Secrets that made Seraphina more valuable and more vulnerable than she could possibly know. They reached the patrol vehicles in silence, but Kieran's wolf was restless beneath his skin. The forest felt wrong today, charged with the kind of tension that preceded either storms or bloodshed. As they drove toward the ridge, he found his thoughts drifting back to the moment he'd pulled Sarah against his chest, the way she'd felt perfect there despite everything between them. The scent of her fear had been almost unbearable, not fear of the fall, but fear of him. After everything he'd sacrificed, everything he'd done to keep her alive, she still saw him as nothing more than her father's killer. Maybe that was for the best. Maybe it was easier than the truth. The Eastern Ridge rose like a jagged spine against the afternoon sky, its slopes covered in dense pine and dangerous secrets. Kieran's patrol approached cautiously, but the vehicles Garrett had mentioned were long gone. Only tire tracks and disturbed earth remained, along with a scent that made Kieran's blood run cold. Hunters, he growled, his wolf pushing closer to the surface. Not human hunters. Those were a manageable threat, easily avoided or eliminated. These were the other kind, the ones who knew exactly what they were hunting and had the silver bullets to bring it down. Marcus Blackthorn had spent decades keeping them away from Shadowcrest territory. Now that protection was gone, and the vultures were circling. How many? Garrett asked, already reaching for his phone to alert the pack. Kieran crouched beside the clearest tire track, his enhanced senses parsing the information written in rubber and earth. At least 6. Well-equipped. They've been watching for weeks. The implications hit him like a physical blow. If the hunters were moving on Shadowcrest territory, they weren't just after random wolves. They were after something specific, something they believed was hidden in these mountains. Something Marcus had died keeping secret. Or someone. Double the border patrols, Kieran ordered, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency. Full pack alert. No one travels alone, especially near the old territories. Sir, one of his younger wolves spoke up hesitantly. What about the Shadowcrest survivors? If hunters are in the area, what about them? Kieran's tone could have frozen hellfire, but inside, his wolf was howling with protective fury. The idea of those bastards getting their hands on Sarah, of silver bullets finding their mark in her beautiful, defiant body. He cut off that line of thinking before it could drive him to do something stupid. Like storming across 3 territories to find her, to wrap her in steel and claws and keep her safe whether she wanted his protection or not. The surviving Shadowcrest wolves made their choice when they refused integration, he continued coldly. They're no longer our responsibility. It was a lie, and from Garrett's expression, his lieutenant knew it. But some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, especially when enemy ears might be listening. They returned to the main compound as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The Iron Ridge territory sprawled across a natural valley, its heart dominated by the Great Hall where pack meetings were held and justice dispensed. Kieran had expanded it considerably since claiming leadership, adding training facilities and defensive structures that would have impressed a military strategist. None of it felt like home. Alpha. The voice belonged to Elena Ravencrest, the pack's senior healer, and one of the few wolves brave enough to speak truth to power. She approached with her usual combination of respect and barely concealed disapproval. We need to talk. Kieran nodded toward his private study, a room lined with books on pack law and military strategy. Elena followed, closing the door behind her with the deliberate care of someone preparing to deliver unwelcome news. The pack is growing restless, she said without preamble. 3 years of guerrilla warfare and now hunter sightings. They're starting to wonder if claiming Shadowcrest territory was worth the cost. Are you questioning my leadership, Elena? The words came out sharper than intended, but Kieran was in no mood for political maneuvering. The older woman's gray eyes met his, without flinching. I'm questioning your priorities. That girl has been a thorn in our side since her father's death, and today you had her in your hands. Why didn't you end it? Because she smells like wildflowers and rain. Because her eyes hold pain that mirrors my own. Because killing her would destroy whatever's left of my soul. Seraphina poses no real threat, he said instead. Her attacks are nuisances, nothing more. Elena's laugh was bitter. Tell that to the supply convoy she sabotaged last month. Or the patrol she led into a bog trap 2 weeks ago. She's not the scared girl who fled after the challenge, Kieran. She's become something else. Something dangerous. Something magnificent, his wolf whispered. Something that calls to every instinct we've tried to suppress. Your point? Kieran asked aloud. My point is that mercy can be a luxury we can't afford. Not with hunters circling and the council breathing down our necks about territorial stability. The other packs are watching, waiting for signs of weakness. Kieran turned to stare out the window, where the last light of day was painting the mountains blood red. Somewhere out there, Sarah was planning her next attack, driven by a hatred he'd carefully cultivated to keep her alive. The irony was almost unbearable. The council will get their stability, he said quietly, and the hunters will find nothing worth taking in these mountains. And the girl? Kieran's reflection stared back at him from the darkening glass, a man carrying burdens no one else could understand. The girl is none of your concern. Elena was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. You know, Marcus Blackthorne was a friend of mine. We trained together as young wolves, before pack politics drove us apart. He was a good man, Kieran. A good alpha. Is there a point to this reminiscence? Just this, whatever he asked of you before he died, whatever promise you made in those final moments, it's eating you alive. And secrets have a way of surfacing at the worst possible times. She left without another word, but her warning echoed in the growing darkness. Kieran remained at the window long after her footsteps faded, his enhanced hearing picking up the sounds of his pack settling in for the night.
Patrols checking in.
Sentries taking their positions. The comfortable rhythms of a territory at peace. But peace was an illusion, and Kieran had learned long ago that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who wore familiar faces. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from a contact he'd hoped never to hear from again. The item is confirmed. Timeline accelerated. Payment terms unchanged. Kieran deleted the message and crushed the phone in his bare hands, but the damage was done. The hunters weren't just circling, they had specific intelligence, specific targets. Which meant someone in the supernatural community was feeding them information. Someone who knew about the Blackthorn bloodline's greatest secret. In the distance, a wolf howled, wild and lonely and fierce. Kieran's heart clenched as he recognized the voice, even altered by distance and desperate grief. Sarah was out there somewhere, believing herself abandoned and alone, while forces she couldn't imagine closed in around her. Protect her, Marcus had whispered as his life bled away. Whatever the cost. The cost, Kieran was beginning to realize, might be everything he'd built in the 3 years since. But as that haunting howl echoed across the mountains, he knew he'd pay it gladly if it meant keeping one violet-eyed wolf safe from the darkness that was coming. Even if she never forgave him for the lies he'd had to tell. Even if she never understood that saving her had required becoming the monster she needed to hate. Chapter 3. Ghosts in the Moonlight. The abandoned cabin squatted among the pines like a wounded animal, its roof sagging under years of neglect and mountain weather. Seraphina pushed through the overgrown door, her enhanced senses immediately cataloging the familiar scents, dust, decay, and the lingering traces of wolves who'd once called this place home. Her pack's safe house had seen better days, but it was still the closest thing to sanctuary the Shadow Crest survivors possessed. About time, Lydia Nightwind called from her position by the cracked window, where she maintained watch over the approaches. The auburn-haired she-wolf had been Sarah's closest friend since childhood, and 3 years of guerrilla warfare had forged their bond into something stronger than steel. We were starting to think Iron Ridge had finally caught their prize. Not today. Sarah dropped her pack beside the cold fireplace, trying to ignore the way her hands still trembled from Kieran's touch. Though it was closer than I'd like. How close? The question came from Thomas Greymane, the grizzled former beta who'd served her father for 20 years. His left arm hung useless at his side, a souvenir from the night they'd fled Iron Ridge's retribution, but his tactical mind remained as sharp as ever. Sarah hesitated, unwilling to admit just how thoroughly Kieran had outmaneuvered her. He was tracking the reconnaissance team. Got suspicious when he caught my scent. Suspicious enough to come after you personally? Lydia's green eyes narrowed with concern. That's new. Usually, he sends Garrett or one of the other lieutenants to deal with our pranks. Thomas grunted his agreement. 3 years of hit-and-run attacks, and Steelclaws never bothered hunting you himself. Why now? Because of the way he looked at me in that tree. Because his hands were gentle when they should have been cruel. Because there's something in his eyes that makes my wolf whine with longing I refuse to acknowledge. Does it matter? Sarah asked instead. The Eastern Ridge operation was a success. We confirmed hunter activity near the old mining roads. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. Thomas went rigid, his scarred face twisting with old pain. You're certain? Tire tracks. Recent. At least 6 vehicles, maybe more. Sarah pulled out the photographs she'd managed to take during her scouting run. They've been surveilling the territory for weeks. Lydia cursed in 3 languages, her partial shift rippling through her as claws extended. They're getting bolder. First the Crescent Moon Pack in Oregon, then the Whisperwind Territory in Colorado. Now, they're coming for us. They're coming for something, Thomas corrected grimly. The question is what? Sarah stared at the photographs, trying to read meaning in scattered tire tracks and disturbed earth. The hunters were a nightmare from the old stories, humans who'd learned to track and kill supernatural creatures with ruthless efficiency. Most packs had some protocol for dealing with them, usually involving strategic retreat and laying low until the threat passed. But the Shadowcrest pack had no territory to retreat to, no safe haven beyond these decaying hideouts. And if the hunters were specifically targeting this area, we need to contact the other survivors, she decided. Get everyone to the secondary safe houses until we know more. Already sent word, Thomas replied. But Sarah, there's something else. Something you need to know about why the hunters might be so interested in our old territory. The way he said it made her wolf prick its ears in alarm. Thomas had been her father's most trusted advisor, privy to pack secrets that went back generations. If he was worried, tell me. Thomas exchanged a look with Lydia, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, he nodded toward the cabin's single bedroom. This conversation needs privacy. And probably whiskey. The bedroom had once belonged to her great-grandmother, a powerful she-wolf who'd ruled the Shadowcrest pack with iron will and mystical wisdom. Sarah settled on the dusty bed, surrounded by faded photographs and the lingering scent of lavender and old magic. Thomas produced a flask from his jacket and took a long pull before passing it to her. The whiskey burned, but it helped steady her nerves for whatever revelation was coming. Your father never told you about the Blackthorn legacy, Thomas began carefully. He thought you were too young, that there would be time to prepare you properly. Then Steelclaw's challenge came and he died keeping secrets. Sarah's voice was sharp with old pain. I'm not a child anymore, Thomas. Whatever it is, I can handle it. The older wolf studied her for a long moment, taking in the scars on her hands, the hardened set of her jaw, the way she held herself, like a weapon ready for use. Finally, he nodded. The Blackthorn bloodline carries more than just alpha genetics, he said quietly. We're descendants of the first wolves, the ones who made the original pact with the moon goddess herself. That connection grants certain abilities. Sarah frowned. You mean the enhanced healing? The stronger pack bonds? Most alpha bloodlines have.
No.
Thomas's voice cut through her assumptions like a blade. I mean the ability to sense supernatural energies across vast distances. To track other magical creatures without shifting. To influence the behavior of both wolves and humans through will alone. The flask trembled in Sarah's hands. She'd always known she was different. Her senses were sharper than other wolves, her intuition uncannily accurate, her ability to read people's true intentions almost supernatural. But she'd assumed those were just natural talents, enhanced by alpha genetics and years of survival training. The hunters know, Thomas continued. They've always known. Your bloodline is mentioned in their oldest texts, classified as a Class 1 supernatural asset. In the right hands, a Blackthorn alpha could locate and control supernatural creatures across entire continents. Control them how? The words came out as barely a whisper. Force shifting. Compelled behavior. Complete subjugation of will. Thomas's scarred face was grim. The early hunters tried to capture and breed Blackthorn wolves for generations. Your ancestors fought wars to keep that from happening. Sarah's mind reeled with the implications. Her father's overprotectiveness suddenly made sense, as did his desperate attempts to keep her hidden from pack politics. She'd thought he was holding her back out of old-fashioned sexism. Instead, he'd been protecting her from a legacy that made her a target for every monster hunter on the continent. Does Kieran know? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Thomas's expression turned carefully neutral. Why would you ask about him specifically? Because he looked at me like he was seeing a ghost. Because his scent carries guilt and pain and something that might have been longing. Because my wolf recognizes something in him that my human mind refuses to acknowledge. He killed my father, she said instead. If the Blackthorn bloodline is so powerful, wouldn't he want to eliminate any potential threats? Perhaps. Thomas didn't sound entirely convinced. Or perhaps there are things about your father's death that you don't fully understand. Before Sarah could demand an explanation, Lydia's voice carried through the cabin walls. Movement on the North Ridge. Multiple vehicles, approaching fast. Sarah was on her feet instantly, enhanced senses reaching out to taste the night air. Through the broken windows, she caught the scent of unfamiliar humans, gun oil, and something else, something that made her wolf cower in primitive terror.
Silver.
Lots of it. Hunters, Thomas breathed, his good hand already reaching for the rifle he kept beside the bed. How did they find us? Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. The safe house's location was known only to a handful of Shadowcrest survivors, and she'd been careful to approach through routes that would mask her scent trail. Unless someone had been following her all along. Someone whose tracking skills were legendary even among wolves.
Kieran.
The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. He'd seemed different in the tree, gentler somehow, but it had all been an act. He'd let her go knowing she'd lead him straight to her pack's hideout, straight to the people she was trying to protect. "Back exit," she ordered, forcing tactical thinking through the haze of pain and rage. "Thomas, can you travel?" The former beta nodded grimly. Fast enough to keep up with two she-wolves and stay ahead of silver bullets. They moved with the practiced efficiency of wolves who'd spent 3 years running from superior forces. Sarah grabbed their emergency packs while Lydia disabled the basic alarm system that would have alerted any other survivors to the compromise. Thomas covered their rear, his damaged arm cradled against his chest, but his good hand steady on his weapon. The back of the cabin opened onto a steep slope that led down to a creek bed. Perfect for masking scent trails, but also perfect for ambush if the hunters had anticipated their escape route. Sarah's enhanced senses probed the darkness, searching for any sign of the enemy. What she found instead made her blood freeze in her veins. Kieran's scent, fresh and strong, coming from the direction of their intended escape route. But instead of the triumph she'd expected, his emotional signature carried desperation, fear, and something that might have been protective fury. "He's here," she whispered to her companions. "Steel Claw." Thomas's voice was grimmer than death. "Then we're trapped between two enemies." "Maybe not." Sarah strained her supernatural hearing, picking up fragments of conversation carried on the mountain wind. The voices were human, discussing search patterns and silver ammunition loads. But underneath, barely audible even to her enhanced senses, was the sound of something else, something that made her wolf perk up with confused recognition. Another wolf, moving through the forest with predatory stealth. Moving toward the hunters. Hunting the hunters. There. Lydia pointed toward a gap in the trees where moonlight revealed a massive dark shape flowing between the shadows. "Is that Kieran?" Sarah breathed, and this time her wolf's response wasn't fear or hatred. It was something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. Because the alpha of the Iron Ridge pack wasn't leading the hunters to their hideout. He was stalking them through the forest like the apex predator he was, amber eyes gleaming with lethal intent as he positioned himself between the human threat and the wolves they were hunting. Between the hunters and her. The first scream shattered the mountain silence, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire and the wet sounds of silver bullets finding their mark. But the agonized cry hadn't come from a wolf. It had come from a human throat, cut short by fangs and fury. Sarah found herself moving before conscious thought could stop her, racing down the slope toward a battle she didn't understand. Behind her, she could hear Thomas and Lydia calling her name, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. All she could focus on was the scent of Kieran's blood mixing with gun smoke and silver, and the terrible knowledge that the man she'd hated for 3 years was bleeding in the darkness to protect her. Whatever the cost, she thought, her father's voice echoing in her memory. Protect her, whatever the cost. But as she reached the edge of the battle and saw Kieran's wolf form surrounded by armed humans, Sarah realized that some costs might be too high for either of them to pay. Chapter 4. Blood and Silver. The clearing erupted in chaos and gunfire as Sarah crashed through the treeline, her partial shift lending superhuman speed to her desperate charge. 6 hunters had Kieran surrounded, their silver-loaded weapons gleaming in the moonlight as they tried to bring down the massive black wolf that moved between them like liquid death. He was magnificent and terrible, a force of nature unleashed. But he was also bleeding from at least 3 silver wounds, his movements growing slower with each passing second as the cursed metal worked its poison through his system. "Behind you!" Sarah screamed the warning as one of the hunters swung his rifle toward Kieran's blind spot. Her voice cut through the battle din, and for one crucial moment, every combatant froze. Kieran's massive head swung toward her, amber eyes widening with something that might have been horror. The hunters spun to face this new threat, their weapons tracking toward her with professional precision. And in that suspended instant, Sarah felt something awaken in her blood, something ancient and powerful and absolutely terrifying. The compulsion rolled out of her like a tidal wave, invisible but overwhelming. Sleep, her will commanded, backed by generations of blackthorn power. Drop your weapons and sleep. 3 of the hunters crumpled instantly, their rifles clattering to the forest floor as their minds simply shut down. The other 3 staggered, fighting against the supernatural influence with training and technology and sheer human stubbornness. One of them, a grizzled veteran with scars marking his neck, managed to raise his weapon despite the psychic assault. Class 1 asset confirmed. He snarled into a radio mic. Repeat, Blackthorn Air is active. Authorize immediate termination protocols. The silver bullet caught Sarah in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending white-hot agony through her entire nervous system. But even as she fell, her power lashed out again, this time fueled by pain and fury and 3 years of suppressed grief. Forget, she commanded with the last of her strength. Forget you ever saw us. Forget we exist. The remaining hunters stumbled backward, their faces going slack as the psychic command rewrote their short-term memories. Within seconds, they were wandering away from the clearing with the confused expressions of people who'd forgotten why they'd come to the forest in the first place. Sarah collapsed to her knees, blood streaming from the silver wound as her vision grayed at the edges. Using that much power without training or preparation had been like grabbing a live wire, effective but potentially fatal. Warm hands caught her before she could fall face-first into the pine needles. Kieran had shifted back to human form, his naked body marked with silver burns and claw marks, but his touch was infinitely gentle as he gathered her against his chest. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough with pain and something else. "Why did you come back for me?" Sarah tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. The silver bullet was lodging deeper, sending poisonous fire through her supernatural healing system. Her wolf whimpered and retreated, leaving her feeling hollow and wrong in ways she'd never experienced. "The silver," she managed to whisper. "It's not coming out." Kieran's jaw tightened as he examined the wound. His fingers probed the entry point with practiced skill, and Sarah realized with a shock that he'd done this before, treated silver poisoning, saved wolves from the cursed metal that could kill their kind. "It's deep," he said quietly, "and close to major arteries. I need to get you somewhere safe before I can extract it." "Safe?" Sarah's laugh came out as more of a gasp. "There is no safe. Not for me. Not anymore." "There is." Kieran's amber eyes met hers, blazing with an intensity that made her breath catch. "There always has been. You just never knew it." Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the forest stillness. Multiple engines, coming fast from different directions. The hunters might have forgotten their encounter, but their backup teams were still following the original mission parameters. "Can you shift?" Kieran asked urgently. Sarah tried to reach for her wolf form and immediately regretted it. The silver in her system made the transformation feel like trying to pour acid through her veins.
No.
The metals interfering with everything. Kieran muttered something that sounded like a prayer and a curse combined. Then he was lifting her in his arms, his supernatural strength making her weight negligible as he carried her deeper into the forest. "Where are we going?" Sarah tried to stay alert, but the silver poisoning was spreading through her system like molten lead. Every heartbeat sent fresh waves of agony through her shoulder and down her arm. "Somewhere they'll never think to look," Kieran replied, his voice tight with concentration as he navigated through the dense undergrowth. "Somewhere that's been waiting for you to come home." They moved through the forest with fluid grace, Kieran's enhanced senses guiding them around patrol routes and surveillance zones that Sarah hadn't even known existed. The man carrying her was nothing like the monster from her nightmares. He was careful with her injured shoulder, gentle when the terrain grew rough, his body radiating protective warmth that made her wolf stir despite the silver's suppression. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they emerged into a hidden valley that took Sarah's breath away. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches forming a natural cathedral that filtered moonlight into silver pools. At the valley's heart stood a cabin unlike any she'd ever seen, built from logs that seemed to glow with their own inner light, windows that sparkled like captured stars. "What is this place?" she whispered. Your birthright, Kieran said simply. The original Blackthorn sanctuary. Your father showed it to me once, before everything went wrong. He carried her up the cabin steps and through a door that opened at his touch, as if the building itself recognized her presence. Inside, the space was impossibly warm and welcoming, furnished with handcrafted furniture and lined with books that seemed older than memory. Kieran laid her carefully on a massive bed covered in furs and soft blankets. The moment her body touched the mattress, Sarah felt something shift in the air around them. The silver's burning diminished slightly, replaced by a tingling warmth that seemed to emanate from the cabin itself. This place is warded, she realized aloud. Blessed by moon magic. Your great-great-grandmother's work, Kieran confirmed as he moved around the room, gathering supplies from cabinets that appeared to be stocked for medical emergencies. She was the last true Blackthorn mystic before the bloodline went dormant. The cabin responds to your family's presence, offers protection and healing to those with the right blood. Sarah watched him work with growing confusion. This wasn't the behavior of a conquering enemy. This was the behavior of someone who cared deeply about her welfare. Someone who'd planned for this exact scenario. You've been here before, she said, not making it a question. Kieran's hands stilled over the medical kit he'd been assembling. When he looked at her, his amber eyes held 3 years of carefully hidden pain. Many times, especially in those first months after your father died, I needed to understand what I was protecting. Protecting? The word came out sharper than intended. You killed him, Kieran.
You destroyed my pack, scattered my people.
How is that protection? Kieran moved to sit beside her on the bed, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. Because Marcus asked me to. Because, with his dying breath, he made me promise to keep you safe from the forces that were already moving against your bloodline. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. That's impossible. I was there. I saw. You saw what needed to be seen, Kieran said gently. What the real enemies needed to believe. That I was a ruthless alpha who'd eliminated the Blackthorn line for territorial gain. That you were just another refugee wolf, powerless and broken. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device, an audio recorder, old-fashioned but well-maintained. Your father gave me this before our challenge. Instructions, in case something happened to him. Would you like to hear his voice? Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Part of her was screaming that this was another manipulation, another lie designed to break down her defenses. But the larger part, the part that had always known there were pieces missing from the night her world ended, desperately needed to know the truth. Play it, she whispered. Kieran pressed a button, and suddenly Marcus Blackthorn's voice filled the cabin, warm and familiar and heartbreakingly alive. If you're hearing this, little star, then the worst has happened, and I'm no longer here to protect you. But I need you to know that everything Kieran Steelclaw does from this moment forward, he does at my request and with my blessing. The hunters are coming, Sarah. They've been tracking our bloodline for months, waiting for the right moment to strike. The only way to keep you safe is to make them believe you're powerless, scattered, no longer a threat. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as her father's voice continued. Kieran will become the monster in your story, because he has to. He'll let you hate him because that hatred will keep you alive, keep you fighting, keep you strong. But know this, my daughter, he is not your enemy. He never was. When the time comes, when you're ready to claim your true heritage, he'll be there to help you take back everything that's yours. The recording ended, leaving only silence and the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing. 3 years of hatred, 3 years of burning for revenge, and it had all been built on a lie. A necessary lie, but a lie nonetheless. He knew he was going to die, she said finally. The challenge was rigged from the start, Kieran confirmed. Marcus was already weakened by hunter toxins. They'd been poisoning him slowly for weeks. He couldn't have won a fair fight, let alone one where he was operating at half strength. So you let everyone think you murdered him in cold blood. It was the only way to sell the deception. To make the hunters believe the Blackthorn threat was eliminated. Kieran's voice carried the weight of 3 years' worth of guilt and isolation. Your father died protecting a secret that could reshape the supernatural world. I've spent every day since trying to be worthy of that sacrifice. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what she'd learned. Everything she believed, everything she'd fought for, had been a carefully constructed fiction designed to keep her alive. And Kieran, the man she'd hated with every fiber of her being, had been her protector all along. The silver bullet, she said suddenly, remembering her injury. You need to get it out before the poisoning spreads. Kieran nodded, his expression growing focused and clinical. This is going to hurt. The cabin's magic will help, but silver extraction is never pleasant. Do it, Sarah said, meeting his eyes with newfound trust. I'm tired of running from the truth. As Kieran began to work, his hands steady and sure despite the intimate nature of the procedure, Sarah found herself studying his face in the moonlight streaming through the windows. The stern mask he wore in public was gone, replaced by something softer and infinitely more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. The man leaning over her wasn't a monster or a conqueror. He was someone who'd sacrificed everything, his reputation, his peace of mind, even the possibility of love, to honor a dying friend's final request. Someone who'd been protecting her for 3 years while she'd been planning his destruction. Someone who was about to discover that the woman he'd saved might already be falling for the man she'd been taught to hate. Chapter 5: Unraveling Hearts. The silver bullet clinked against the cabin's wooden floor like a bell tolling for the dead. Sarah's shoulder throbbed where Kieran had extracted the cursed metal, but the relief flooding through her system was worth every moment of agony. Her wolf stirred for the first time since the battle, testing the limits of her newly freed form. Better? Kieran asked, his hands still gentle as he bandaged the wound with practiced efficiency. Much. Sarah flexed her fingers, marveling at the return of sensation and strength. The cabin's ancient magic hummed through her bones, accelerating her supernatural healing in ways she'd never experienced. This place, it's like being wrapped in moonlight. Kieran's smile was soft and genuine, nothing like the cold mask he wore as the Iron Ridge Alpha. Your great-great-grandmother designed it that way. She wanted a sanctuary where blackthorn wolves could heal both body and spirit. Sarah studied his face in the lamplight, noting the exhaustion lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried invisible burdens. How long have you been coming here? Since the night after your father's funeral. Kieran settled back in the chair beside her bed, his amber eyes distant with memory. I needed to understand what I'd inherited along with Marcus's territory, what I'd agreed to protect. And what did you find? Books. Journals spanning 3 centuries of Blackthorn history. Records of your family's gifts, their battles with the hunters, the alliances they forged, and the prices they paid. His voice grew quieter. I found your father's private writings about you. How proud he was, how terrified he was of what your awakening abilities might bring. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Sarah pulled the cabin's soft blankets higher around her shoulders, hyper-aware of Kieran's proximity and the way his scent, cedar and steel and something uniquely him, made her wolf purr with contentment. Those powers I used tonight, she said carefully. The compulsion, the memory alteration. I've never done anything like that before. Stress can trigger dormant abilities, Kieran replied, especially when someone new. He paused, seeming to catch himself before finishing the thought. When someone important to you is in danger. Someone you what? Sarah wanted to ask, but the question felt too loaded, too dangerous for the fragile truce they'd established. Instead, she focused on safer ground. Thomas said the hunters classify our bloodline as a Class 1 asset. What does that mean exactly? Kieran's expression grew grim. It means they consider you a weapon worth any cost to acquire. The last confirmed Blackthorn mystic died over a century ago, but the stories of what your family could accomplish. He shook his head. Mass compulsions affecting entire cities. The ability to track supernatural creatures across continents. Some accounts claim your ancestors could force unwilling shapeshifters into permanent animal form. Sarah's blood chilled. That's monstrous. Power often is. Kieran leaned forward, his intensity compelling. But it can also be salvation. In the right hands, with the right training, those abilities could protect every supernatural community on the continent. And in the wrong hands, they could enslave us all. The weight of that responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a lead blanket. She'd spent 3 years focused on small-scale revenge, never imagining that her very existence might tip the balance in a war she hadn't even known was being fought.
"The hunters who attacked tonight," she said.
"They were specifically looking for me. They've been triangulating your location for months," Kieran confirmed. "Every time you used your enhanced senses during one of your raids, every moment when your emotions spiked enough to leak psychic energy, they were mapping your signature." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Then I've been putting everyone at risk. Thomas, Lydia, all the other survivors." "You've been surviving," Kieran said firmly. "Which is exactly what your father wanted. But Sarah, the time for hiding is over. Tonight proved that your abilities are active and growing stronger. The hunters won't stop coming, and next time they'll bring more firepower. So, what do you suggest? That I surrender myself to protect everyone else. I suggest you stop running and start fighting back." Kieran's eyes blazed with fierce determination. "I suggest you claim your birthright and become the leader your pack needs. My pack is scattered to the winds. Most of them probably think I'm dead after tonight's attack. Then we gather them, bring them here, to the sanctuary your ancestors built for exactly this purpose." Kieran gestured toward the cabin's walls, which seemed to pulse with contained power. "This valley can house and protect 100 wolves if necessary. The wards your great-great-grandmother wove are still strong enough to hide us from any surveillance, magical or technological." The scope of what he was proposing hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You're talking about rebuilding the Shadowcrest Pack, challenging the established order that's kept the supernatural world stable for decades. I'm talking about preparing for a war that's coming whether we want it or not." Kieran stood and moved to the window, his silhouette outlined against the star-filled sky. "The hunters aren't just targeting your bloodline anymore, Sarah. They're moving against pack territories across the continent, using intelligence that could only come from inside sources. Someone's betraying us. Someone with access to pack hierarchies, territorial agreements, bloodline records." His voice was grim. "Someone who knows exactly which wolves pose the greatest threats to their agenda." Sarah pulled herself upright, ignoring the lingering ache in her shoulder. "You think it's someone from the council?" "I know it is." Kieran turned back to face her, his expression carved from stone. The attack patterns, the timing, the level of detail in their intelligence, it all points to someone with council-level access to pack records. The implications were staggering. The Supernatural Council was supposed to be the governing body that kept peace between the various shapeshifter communities. If someone within that organization was feeding information to the hunters, "We can't fight a war on two fronts," Sarah said quietly. "Not against the hunters and traitors within our own government. We can if we're smart about it." Kieran moved back to her bedside, his presence both comforting and unsettling. "If we rebuild your pack's strength, gather allies, and use your abilities to root out the corruption. My abilities that I barely understand and can't control. That's what training is for." His amber eyes held hers with steady confidence. "Your father left detailed instructions about developing Blackthorn gifts, meditation techniques, power-focusing exercises, safeguards against psychic burnout. Everything you need to become what you were born to be." Sarah studied his face, searching for hidden agendas or manipulation. All she found was genuine belief in her potential and something else, something that made her pulse quicken and her wolf stir with interested recognition. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why are you willing to risk everything to help me? Your pack, your territory, your position, you could lose it all if the council decides you're a threat." Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that made her chest tighten. "Because 3 years ago, I made a promise to a dying man. Because I've watched you fight with nothing but courage and determination, never knowing you had an army of people ready to follow you into hell. Because..." He trailed off, seeming to wrestle with words that wanted to be spoken. "Because?" Sarah prompted, her heart hammering against her ribs. Kieran's eyes met hers, blazing with an intensity that stole her breath. Because somewhere along the way, protecting you stopped being about honor or duty or keeping a promise. It became about the fact that I can't imagine a world without Seraphina Blackthorn in it. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying in its implications. Sarah felt her wolf surge forward, responding to the alpha power and barely restrained desire radiating from the man beside her bed. 3 years of hatred. 3 years of believing he was her enemy. And now, in the space of a single night, everything had changed. "Kieran," she whispered, not sure what she wanted to say or ask or confess. He seemed to understand the chaos in her voice because he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his fingers traced along her jawline with devastating gentleness. "I know this is too much," he said quietly. "I know you need time to process everything that's happened. But Sarah, I need you to know, whatever you decide about the pack, about the war, about your destiny, you won't face it alone. Not anymore." His thumb brushed across her lower lip, and Sarah felt her entire world narrow to that single point of contact. The man she'd hated was touching her like she was made of spun glass and starlight, looking at her like she was the answer to prayers he'd never dared voice. And God help her. She wanted to lean into that touch, to close the distance between them and discover if his lips were as soft as they looked. Instead, the sound of approaching footsteps on the cabin's front porch shattered the moment like breaking glass. Kieran was on his feet instantly, his body shifting into battle-ready alertness. "Stay here," he ordered, moving toward the window to assess the threat. But Sarah was already pushing herself out of bed, her enhanced senses identifying the familiar sense approaching the sanctuary. "It's okay," she said, relief flooding through her. "It's Thomas and Lydia." The front door burst open without ceremony, and Lydia Nightwind stormed into the cabin like an avenging angel. Her auburn hair was wild, her clothes torn from running through the forest, and her green eyes blazed with protective fury. "Sarah?" She crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her friend into a fierce embrace. "When we lost your scent trail, when we found all that blood." "I'm fine," Sarah assured her, returning the hug with equal intensity. Kieran got the silver out. "I'm healing." Lydia's gaze snapped to Kieran, who was watching the reunion with carefully neutral expression. "Steelclaw." Her voice could have frozen summer rain. Interesting timing, showing up to rescue Sarah right when the hunters attacked. "Lydia," Sarah warned, but her friend was already shifting into interrogation mode. 3 years of hidden-run attacks, and suddenly the great Alpha decides to play hero? Lydia's partial shift rippled through her, claws extending as her wolf assessed the perceived threat. "Convenient how you knew exactly where to bring her, exactly how to treat silver poisoning, exactly." "Lydia, stop." Sarah stepped between her friend and Kieran, her voice carrying newfound authority. "He's saved my life. Multiple times. And there are things you need to know about my father's death. About everything we've believed for the past 3 years. Thomas Greymane appeared in the doorway, his weathered face taking in the scene with tactical assessment. His gaze lingered on the blood-stained bandages on Sarah's shoulder, the intimate proximity between her and Kieran, the way the cabin itself seemed to pulse with recognition around her. "Well," he said quietly, "this is an interesting development." As Sarah prepared to shatter her friend's understanding of their world just as thoroughly as hers had been destroyed, she caught Kieran's eye across the room. The heat in his amber gaze promised that their interrupted moment was far from forgotten, and that the next time they were alone, there would be no hiding from the attraction growing between them. Whether that terrified or thrilled her, Sarah wasn't quite ready to admit. Chapter 6: Truth and Consequences. The silence in the cabin stretched taut as a bowstring as Sarah faced her 2 closest allies, people who'd bled beside her, grieved with her, spent 3 years believing the same lie that had shaped her world. Thomas stood in the doorway like a sentinel, his scarred face unreadable, while Lydia vibrated with barely contained suspicion, her green eyes flicking between Sarah and Kieran with predatory intensity. "You're going to tell us that everything we know is wrong, Thomas said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too many betrayals. That Marcus didn't die fighting for his territory. That Steelclaw isn't the enemy we've been planning to destroy. Yes, Sarah said simply. That's exactly what I'm going to tell you. Lydia's laugh was sharp and bitter. Sarah, he's gotten to you somehow. Stockholm Syndrome, or some kind of alpha compulsion. He's gotten to me with the truth. Sarah moved to the cabin's central table, where Kieran had left her father's audio recorder. Daddy left instructions. A message. Everything we've believed about that night, it was necessary deception. She pressed play, and Marcus Blackthorn's voice filled the sanctuary once again. But this time, Sarah watched her friends' faces as the recording shattered their understanding of the past 3 years. Thomas went rigid, his good hand clenching into a fist. Lydia's partial shift receded as shock overrode her protective instincts. When the message ended, Thomas was the first to speak. The poisoning, the weakness in his final weeks that we attributed to stress. His voice was barely above a whisper. He was already dying. The hunters had been targeting him for months, Kieran said quietly. Slow-acting toxins designed to mimic natural aging, to make his eventual death look like the result of a legitimate challenge rather than assassination. Lydia shook her head, auburn hair flying. This is insane. You're asking us to believe that our alpha willingly sacrificed himself, that he chose to let his pack be scattered. To protect something more important than territory, Sarah interrupted. To protect a bloodline ability that could either save or enslave every supernatural creature on the continent. She told them about her newfound powers, about the Blackthorn legacy that made her a target for forces she'd never imagined. Thomas listened with the focused attention of a military strategist, asking sharp questions about the extent of her abilities and the scope of the hunter threat. Lydia remained skeptical until Sarah demonstrated a minor compulsion. Nothing harmful, just a gentle suggestion that made her friend feel inexplicably thirsty. Sweet mother of wolves, Lydia breathed, accepting the glass of water she'd suddenly needed despite not being thirsty moments before. You really can get inside people's heads. It's crude and uncontrolled, Sarah admitted. Daddy's journals apparently contain training techniques, but I haven't had time to study them properly. Time we don't have, Thomas said grimly. If the hunters know you're active, they'll escalate their operations. Bring in specialists, heavier firepower, maybe even try to turn other packs against us by spreading fear about your abilities. Kieran nodded his agreement, which is why we need to move quickly. Gather the surviving Shadowcrest wolves, bring them here to the sanctuary, and begin rebuilding your pack's strength. Here. Lydia looked around the cabin with new eyes, taking in the way shadows seemed to dance independently of the firelight, the way the very air thrummed with contained power. This place is warded by 3 centuries of Blackthorn magic, Sarah finished. My great-great-grandmother's sanctuary, designed to hide and protect our kind. Thomas moved to one of the windows, his tactical mind already assessing defensive positions. How many could it shelter? 100 wolves, maybe more, Kieran replied. There are other buildings deeper in the valley, barracks, training facilities, even an armory. Your ancestors were prepared for war. And now war has found us anyway. Sarah sank back onto the bed, suddenly exhausted by the weight of revelation and responsibility. Thomas, how many Shadowcrest survivors can we realistically contact without compromising their safety? The former beta pulled out a worn notebook, his careful records spanning 3 years of keeping track of scattered pack members. 37 confirmed alive and in hiding. Maybe a dozen more who've gone completely underground. But Sarah, asking them to come here, to trust Steelclaw. They don't have to trust me, Kieran said quietly. They just have to trust their alpha. The title hit Sarah like a physical blow. For 3 years, she'd thought of herself as a refugee, a guerrilla fighter, a survivor. But Marcus Blackthorn's daughter, heir to powers that could reshape the supernatural world, she was meant to be so much more. I don't know if I'm ready, she whispered. Lydia moved to sit beside her on the bed, taking her hand with gentle firmness. Sarah, you've been leading us for 3 years already. Every raid you planned, Every safe house you established, every time you put yourself at risk to protect other survivors, that was leadership. You just didn't have the title to go with it. She's right, Thomas agreed. You have the loyalty of every Shadowcrest wolf still breathing. They'll follow you into hell if you ask them to. The question is, Kieran said, his amber eyes intense, are you willing to ask them to follow you into war? Before Sarah could answer, a new scent drifted through the cabin's open windows, familiar but unexpected, tinged with exhaustion and barely controlled panic. She was on her feet instantly, enhanced senses probing the night air. There's someone else coming, she said. Someone I know. The footsteps on the porch were lighter than Thomas's military stride, more hesitant than Lydia's confident approach. When the door opened, it revealed a face Sarah hadn't seen in over a year, David Ironwood, one of the younger Shadowcrest survivors who'd been maintaining deep cover in a neighboring territory. David. Sarah moved toward him, noting the way his clothes were torn and bloodied, the haunted look in his dark eyes. What are you doing here? How did you even find this place? Something's calling to us, David said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Every Shadowcrest wolf within 100 miles can feel it. A pull, like the pack bond, but stronger. It led me here. Sarah's blood chilled as the implications hit her. The sanctuary. It's responding to my presence, sending out some kind of signal. A gathering call, Thomas breathed. Your great-great-grandmother must have built it into the ward structure. When the true Alpha returns, the sanctuary calls the pack home. Which means every surviving Shadowcrest wolf is going to start converging on this location, Kieran said grimly. Whether they want to or not. And if we can feel it, David continued, then others might be able to track it too. The hunters, rival packs, anyone with the right equipment or magical sensitivity. Sarah's mind raced through the tactical implications. The sanctuary's call would bring her people home, but it would also turn their hidden refuge into a beacon visible to every enemy they'd spent 3 years avoiding. How long, she asked. How long before the others start arriving? David shrugged helplessly. Some were already on the road when I left my safe house 12 hours ago. The pull gets stronger the closer you get, harder to resist. I guess we have maybe a day before the first group starts showing up. A day to prepare for a pack reunion that could either save us all or get everyone killed, Lydia said with dark humor. Sarah looked around the cabin at the faces watching her. Thomas with his military assessment, Lydia with her fierce loyalty, David with his desperate hope, and Kieran with something deeper and more complex than mere alliance. They were all waiting for her decision, her leadership, her vision of what came next. 3 years of hiding were over. The Blackthorn heir had awakened, and there was no going back to the shadows. Then we prepare for war, she said, her voice carrying the authority of generations of alpha blood. Thomas, I need defensive assessments of the entire valley. Lydia, start inventorying whatever supplies and weapons are already here. David, you're going to help me contact the other survivors and coordinate their arrival. And me? Kieran asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Sarah met his amber gaze steadily, seeing past the careful mask to the man who'd sacrificed everything to honor a promise. You're going to help me become the leader my people deserve, starting with those training techniques my father left behind. Because if she was going to claim her birthright, if she was going to protect the wolves depending on her, she needed to master abilities that could either save them all or destroy everything she touched. And she needed to figure out what to do about the growing attraction to the man who'd been her enemy for 3 years, an attraction that was becoming harder to ignore with every shared glance, every moment of understanding, every time he looked at her like she was worth dying for. The Shadowcrest pack was coming home. The question was whether their alpha would be strong enough to lead them into the war that was waiting. Outside, the first howl echoed across the mountains, wild and lonely and filled with desperate hope. The pack was answering the call, and there was no turning back. Chapter 7. Awakening Power. Dawn broke over the hidden valley like a benediction, painting the ancient pines in shades of gold and amber. Sarah stood on the cabin's front porch, watching mist rise from the sacred grove where her ancestors had once performed moon rituals, and tried to process the magnitude of what she'd committed to in the space of a single night. Behind her, she could hear the others moving through the sanctuary, Thomas cataloging weapons in the armory, Lydia exploring the ward boundaries, David setting up communication equipment to coordinate the incoming pack members. All of them working with the focused efficiency of wolves who knew their survival depended on preparation. And somewhere in the cabin's depths, Kieran was studying her father's journals, preparing to teach her abilities that could either save her people or consume her entirely. Second thoughts. Lydia appeared beside her, offering a steaming mug of coffee that smelled like heaven and tasted like liquid courage. About 100 of them, Sarah admitted, accepting the warmth gratefully. Yesterday, I was a refugee planning small-scale sabotage. Today I'm apparently the mystical heir to a bloodline of supernatural enforcers, about to become alpha of a pack that's been scattered for 3 years. Don't forget the part where you're falling for the man you spent 3 years planning to kill. Sarah choked on her coffee. I am not. Please. Lydia's green eyes sparkled with amused affection. I've known you since we were pups. I've seen how you look at chocolate, how you look at a perfect sunset, how you look at that new leather jacket you've been coveting. And honey, the way you were looking at Steelclaw last night, that was all 3 rolled into one incredibly dangerous package. Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks. It's complicated. The best relationships usually are. Lydia leaned against the porch railing, her expression growing more serious. Just be careful, okay? He may have been protecting you, but that doesn't erase 3 years of believing he was the enemy. Your heart's going to need time to catch up with your head. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the morning quiet. Multiple engines, moving carefully through the forest roads that led to the sanctuary. The first wave of returning pack members had arrived. Showtime, Lydia murmured, her partial shift rippling through her as her wolf assessed potential threats. But the scents carried on the mountain breeze were familiar and welcome, pack bonds that had never truly severed despite years of separation. Sarah felt her own wolf surge forward in recognition, eager to reunite with wolves who carried the Shadowcrest bloodline in their veins. The first vehicle to emerge from the treeline was a battered pickup truck that had seen better decades. Behind the wheel sat Elena Moonwhisper, one of the pack's former healers, her silver-streaked hair braided with ritual beads. In the passenger seat, Sarah glimpsed Marcus Shadowdancer, a warrior who'd fought beside her father in territorial disputes spanning 2 decades. More vehicles followed, cars packed with wolves who'd spent 3 years in hiding, their faces showing the marks of hardship and loss, but their eyes blazing with hope as they felt the sanctuary's welcoming embrace. My God, Thomas breathed from the doorway behind them. They're really coming home. Sarah watched her people emerge from their vehicles, some carrying children who'd never seen the Shadowcrest territory, others supporting elders who'd thought they'd die in exile. The sight hit her like a physical blow, the weight of responsibility, the magnitude of what she was asking them to risk by gathering in one place. Alpha. The voice belonged to Elena Moonwhisper, who approached the porch with the careful dignity of a wolf who'd earned her respect through decades of service. We felt the call. The sanctuary sings with your presence. Elena. Sarah stepped forward, suddenly aware that everyone was watching her, waiting for her to prove worthy of the authority they'd traveled hundreds of miles to acknowledge. I'm glad you're safe. All of you. Safe is relative, Marcus Shadowdancer said with dark humor. His left leg bore the marks of old silver wounds, but his warrior's posture remained unbroken. The hunters have been active all along the eastern territories. 3 packs hit in the last month alone. Which is why we're here, Sarah said, allowing alpha authority to flow through her voice. Why we're done hiding and running. It's time to take the fight to them. Murmurs rippled through the gathering pack members, some excited, others worried, all of them looking to her for leadership she was still learning to provide. There are things you need to know, Sarah continued. About the hunters, about my bloodline, about the war that's been building while we've been in exile. But first, let's get everyone settled. The sanctuary has room for all of us, and protections that will keep us safe while we plan our next moves. As the pack dispersed to explore their new refuge, Sarah felt a warm presence at her back. Kieran's scent wrapped around her like a protective cloak, his alpha power blending with hers in ways that should have felt threatening, but instead felt natural. "You're a natural," he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. "They're already following you." "They're following desperation and hope," Sarah replied. "I just hope I can live up to both." "You will." His hand brushed against hers, the contact brief but electric. "But first, we need to start your training. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to control your awakening abilities." Sarah nodded, though part of her wanted to delay the inevitable. Learning to use her Blackthorn gifts meant accepting a level of power that scared her, meant acknowledging that she could influence the minds and wills of others in ways that bordered on violation. "Where?" she asked. "The Grove. Your father's notes mention specific locations within the sanctuary where the bloodline magic is strongest. Natural amphitheaters where your ancestors practiced their arts." They walked through the valley together, past pack members setting up temporary shelters and children playing in forests that recognized their heritage. The sacred grove lay at the sanctuary's heart, a circle of ancient oaks whose branches formed a natural cathedral, their trunks carved with symbols that predated written language. "This place," Sarah whispered, feeling power hum through the very air. "It's like standing inside a heartbeat." "Your great-great-grandmother's masterwork," Kieran agreed. She wove 3 centuries of bloodline magic into these trees, creating a focus point for Blackthorn abilities. He pulled out Marcus's journal, the leather binding worn smooth by countless readings. "According to this, the first lesson is learning to sense the supernatural energies around you without being overwhelmed by them. And if I can't control it, if the power decides it wants to use me instead of the other way around." Kieran's amber eyes met hers with steady confidence. "Then I'll be here to anchor you, to pull you back if you go too deep." The trust implicit in that statement made Sarah's chest tighten. This man who'd sacrificed his reputation to protect her, who'd spent 3 years letting her hate him for crimes he'd never committed, was now offering to risk his own mind to help her master abilities that could enslave him. "Kieran," she said softly, "if something goes wrong, if I accidentally compel you, you won't." He stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring. "I know you, Sarah." The woman who spent 3 years fighting impossible odds to protect her people, who risked her life to save an enemy she thought had murdered her father, that woman would never use her gifts to violate someone's free will. His faith in her was humbling and terrifying in equal measure. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to center herself the way her father's note suggested, and immediately felt the grove's power rushing toward her like a tide. It was overwhelming. Layers of magical energy built up over centuries, the psychic imprints of every Blackthorn who'd ever practiced their arts in this sacred space. She could feel her ancestors' presence, their knowledge, their desperate hope that someday their bloodline would produce an heir strong enough to protect what they'd built. "Easy." Kieran's voice cut through the magical storm, his hand on her shoulder providing a lifeline to the physical world. "Don't try to absorb it all at once. Just let it flow through you." Sarah followed his guidance, allowing the power to wash over her rather than fighting to contain it. Gradually, the chaos resolved into something manageable, streams of energy she could direct rather than an ocean that threatened to drown sense every wolf in the sanctuary, their emotional states, their pack bonds, the subtle supernatural signatures that marked them as her people. Beyond the valley's borders, she felt other presences, human hunters maintaining surveillance from concealed positions, rival pack scouts testing the sanctuary's defenses, something darker and more dangerous moving through the mountain her. And, with that control came awareness. She couldn't like a predator seeking prey. "There's someone else out there," she said, her eyes snapping open. "Something that doesn't feel entirely human." Kieran's expression darkened. "Where?" Sarah pointed toward the valley's northern ridge, where the sensation of wrongness was strongest. "Moving parallel to our borders. It feels like." She struggled to find words for the alien signature her enhanced senses were detecting. Like a hunter, but altered somehow. Enhanced. Hybrid. Kieran breathed, and the fear in his voice made Sarah's blood run cold. They're using supernatural volunteers now. Humans enhanced with shapeshifter genetics, loyal to the hunter cause, but possessing our abilities. Is that even possible? Your bloodline could make it possible, he said grimly. If they captured a Blackthorn mystic, used compulsion to force compliance from shapeshifter subjects, they could create an army of enhanced soldiers with all our strengths and none of our pack loyalties. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Not only was she a target because of her abilities, she was potentially the key to creating weapons that could destroy every supernatural community on the continent. Then we stopped them, she said, power thrumming through her voice with new determination. We find whoever's betraying pack locations to the hunters, we eliminate the hybrid threat, and we make it clear that the supernatural world won't be hunted into extinction.
We.
Kieran asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer.
We.
Sarah met his gaze steadily, seeing past the alpha mask to the man who'd become her anchor in a storm of revelation and responsibility. I'm going to need allies for what's coming. Powerful ones. And whether the council likes it or not, the Iron Ridge and Shadowcrest packs are now united in this fight. The alliance she was proposing went far beyond military cooperation. It was a declaration that whatever had been between them, enemy, protector, the growing attraction neither was quite ready to name, had evolved into something deeper. Something worth fighting for. The council will call it an illegal merger, Kieran warned. Demand explanations, threaten sanctions. Let them try. Sarah's smile was sharp as winter steel. I have 3 centuries of Blackthorn magic at my disposal, and a pack that's tired of running. If the council wants to make this a political fight, they're going to discover just how dangerous a cornered mystic can be. As if summoned by her declaration, a howl echoed across the valley, not the greeting call of arriving pack members, but the warning cry of sentries who'd spotted a threat. The hybrid was making its move, testing their defenses, probing for weaknesses. Training's over, Sarah said, power crackling around her like barely contained lightning. Time to see what a Blackthorn Alpha can really do. The war for the supernatural world's future was about to begin, and it would be fought by 2 alphas who discovered that sometimes the greatest strength came from standing together against impossible odds. Even if neither was quite ready to admit they might be falling in love in the process. Chapter 8. Fire and Shadow. The hybrid moved through the forest like a perversion of nature itself, human intelligence directing supernatural speed and strength, but lacking the soul-deep connection to the wild that defined true shapeshifters. Sarah tracked its approach through her enhanced senses, feeling the wrongness of its presence, like acid on her skin. Northeast Ridge, closing fast, she reported to the defensive positions Thomas had established around the sanctuary's perimeter. It's alone, but that doesn't mean it's not dangerous. Could be a scout, Kieran said, his own wolf pushing close to the surface as he prepared for battle. Testing our responses, gathering intelligence for a larger force. Through the pack bond, Sarah felt her people taking defensive positions, warriors shifting to wolf form, healers preparing medical stations, civilians moving to the sanctuary's most protected areas. 3 years of guerrilla warfare had taught them to respond to threats with practiced efficiency, but this felt different. More personal. It's not just scouting, Sarah realized, her mystical senses probing the creature's alien signature. It's hunting. Looking for something specific. Looking for you, Kieran said grimly. Your power signature is stronger now that you're in the grove, easier to track. The implications sent ice through Sarah's veins. Every moment she spent developing her abilities made her more visible to enemies who wanted to capture or kill her. But without those abilities, she had no chance of protecting her people from the forces arrayed against them. Then let's give it what it's looking for, she said, power crackling around her like barely contained lightning. But not what it expects. The hybrid broke from the trilene in a rush of inhuman speed, its altered form standing 7 feet tall and covered in a mixture of human flesh and wolf fur that looked like it had been assembled by a madman. Silver-enhanced claws gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and its eyes held the cold intelligence of a predator that felt no kinship with its prey. Sarah stepped into the grove's center, making herself an obvious target while Kieran and the other warriors positioned themselves in the surrounding trees. Her father's journals had mentioned combat applications for Blackthorn abilities, but she'd never tested them against a real enemy. Today would be her trial by fire. Seraphina Blackthorn. The hybrid spoke, its voice a disturbing mixture of human speech and animal growl. The Council of Hunters extends an invitation to discuss terms of surrender. I wasn't aware we were at war, Sarah replied, though her enhanced senses were already probing the creature's mind, searching for weaknesses she could exploit. You declared war the moment you awakened abilities that threatened human supremacy, the hybrid snarled. But our masters are merciful. Surrender yourself for study, and your pack will be allowed to live as cattle rather than being exterminated as predators. Sarah's power flared in response to the insult, but she forced herself to remain calm. Anger would make her magic unpredictable, dangerous to her own people as well as her enemies. Interesting offer, she said. But I have a counter-proposal. Before the hybrid could respond, Sarah's will lashed out like a psychic whip, seeking to dominate its enhanced mind the way she'd controlled the human hunters. But instead of the easy compliance she'd experienced before, she met resistance, layers of mental conditioning and technological enhancement that turned her compulsion aside like armor-deflecting arrows. Did you think we came unprepared? The hybrid's laugh was like breaking glass. Every volunteer for the enhancement program undergoes psychic conditioning to resist supernatural influence. Your bloodline's greatest weapon is useless against us. It lunged forward with inhuman speed, silver claws aimed at Sarah's throat. But Kieran was already moving, his wolf form intercepting the attack in a collision that shook the ancient oaks. The two predators rolled across the grove floor in a tangle of fangs and fury, while Sarah tried to find an opening for her abilities that wouldn't risk harming her ally. The hybrid was stronger than any natural wolf, its enhanced muscles driving silver claws deep into Kieran's shoulder before he could twist away. But Kieran had decades of combat experience and the tactical intelligence of a true alpha. He used the creature's overconfidence against it, leading it into positions where the grove's natural barriers limited its mobility. Sarah? Lydia's voice carried from the perimeter. More movement on the southern approach. This was a distraction. The realization hit like a physical blow. While they'd been focused on the hybrid, other enemies had been moving into position. Through her expanded senses, Sarah felt them now. Human hunters with silver weapons moving to surround the sanctuary while its defenders were occupied. Thomas, pull back to secondary positions, she ordered through the pack bond. They're trying to box us in. But even as she coordinated the defense, part of her attention remained fixed on Kieran's battle with the hybrid. The creature's claws had found their mark repeatedly, silver poisoning slowing the Iron Ridge Alpha's movements despite his superior tactics. Sarah's power flared again, but this time she didn't try to dominate the hybrid's mind. Instead, she reached deeper, touching the grove's ancient magic and channeling it through her bloodline connection to the land itself. The oaks responded to her call, their branches bending with impossible flexibility to entangle the hybrid's limbs. Roots erupted from the earth to wrap around its ankles, while the very air grew thick and oppressive with mystical energy. Impossible, the hybrid snarled, struggling against bonds that drew strength from 3 centuries of accumulated power. The old magics are dead. Folklore and superstition. Then you really don't understand what you're hunting, Sarah said, her voice echoing with harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. She pressed her advantage, calling on every lesson her father's journals had taught her about channeling the land's power. The hybrid's enhanced physiology made it resistant to mental compulsion, but it was still partially dependent on supernatural energies. Energies she could now manipulate. The creature's struggles grew weaker as Sarah drained the stolen shapeshifter genetics from its system, leaving behind only human flesh and bone trapped in a body that had been designed for something far more powerful. Its silver enhancements became liabilities, poisoning the human nervous system they'd been grafted onto. What did you do to me? It gasped, the alien strength fading from its limbs. Gave you back your humanity, Sarah replied, though the effort of channeling so much power left her swaying on her feet. Whether that's a gift or a curse depends on what you do with it. Kieran shifted back to human form, silver wounds marking his chest and shoulders, but his amber eyes blazing with fierce pride. The hunters? Retreating, Thomas reported through the pack bond. Whatever you did to their enhanced soldier, it spooked them. They're pulling back to regroup. Sarah nodded, though she could barely remain standing. Using the Grove's power directly had been like trying to channel a lightning storm through her body, effective but potentially fatal if she'd maintained it much longer. "We need to talk," she said to the former hybrid, who was now fully human and looking at his hands like he'd never seen them before. "About who sent you, what they're planning, and why you volunteered to become a monster in service to people who see you as expendable." The man, for that's all he was now, stripped of his artificial enhancements, looked up at her with eyes that held confusion and dawning horror.
I
remember agreeing to the procedure.
But not why.
The conditioning, it's breaking down without the supernatural reinforcement. Good, Sarah said firmly. That means you can choose who you want to be, instead of letting others make that choice for you. As Thomas and the other warriors secured their unexpected prisoner, Sarah became aware of Kieran watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. His wounds were already healing thanks to his alpha constitution, but concern for him still twisted in her chest. "You're hurt," she said, moving closer despite the pack members who might be watching. "I've had worse," he replied, though his voice carried a roughness that suggested the silver had done more damage than he wanted to admit. "That was incredible, what you did. I've never seen anyone channel land magic like that." "I'm not sure I could do it again," Sarah admitted. It felt like trying to hold onto a hurricane. Kieran's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with devastating gentleness. "You saved all of us. And you found a way to help that creature, instead of simply destroying it." The admiration in his voice made something warm and dangerous unfurl in Sarah's chest. Standing this close to him, she could see the silver flecks in his amber eyes, could smell the cedar and steel scent that had haunted her dreams for 3 years. But now, instead of hatred and fear, that scent triggered very different responses. "Kieran," she whispered, not sure what she wanted to say or ask or confess. His other hand settled on her waist, drawing her closer until they were sharing breath. "We should probably talk about what's happening between us." "Probably," Sarah agreed, though talking was the last thing on her mind as his head dipped toward hers. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like the brutal claiming she might have expected from an alpha. Instead, it was soft and questioning, asking permission even as it offered everything. Sarah melted into it, her hands fisting in his shirt as 3 years of suppressed attraction finally found expression. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard and the pack bond was singing with complex emotions from the wolves who'd witnessed their alpha claiming her mate. "Well," Lydia called from somewhere behind them, "that's going to complicate the political situation." "Everything about this situation is complicated," Sarah replied, though she didn't step away from Kieran's embrace. "Adding one more complication isn't going to change our basic strategy." "Which is?" Thomas asked, approaching with the careful neutrality of a military advisor who suspected his alpha had just made a decision that would reshape pack politics. "Simple," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of a blackthorn mystic and the determination of a woman who'd found something worth fighting for. "We're going to find whoever's betraying supernatural communities to the hunters. We're going to shut down their hybrid enhancement program. And we're going to make it clear that the age of hiding and running is over." She looked around at her people, warriors bearing scars from years of exile, healers who'd tended wounds that should have been treated in proper medical facilities, children who'd grown up knowing only fear and uncertainty. All of them looking to her for leadership that could either save them or doom them all. "The hunters want a war?" Sarah continued, power crackling around her like barely contained starlight. "Then let's give them one they'll never forget." As her pack prepared for the battles to come, Sarah remained in Kieran's arms, drawing strength from his presence, while her mind raced through the challenges ahead. The hybrid's attack had been a test, a probing action to assess her abilities and defenses. The real assault was still coming. But for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't facing the future alone. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to tip the balance in a war where the stakes were nothing less than the survival of their kind. The revolution had begun. The only question was whether love could flourish in the midst of such darkness, or if the forces arrayed against them would destroy everything she'd just started to hope for. Chapter 9. The Price of Truth. The Supernatural Council's emergency session convened at midnight, conducted through encrypted video channels that connected pact territories across the continent. Sarah sat in the sanctuary's communication center, Kieran's solid presence beside her providing strength as faces appeared on the screens. Alphas who ruled territories spanning from the Canadian Rockies to the Florida Everglades, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Seraphina Blackthorn, Council Chairman Victor Drakemore's voice carried the authority of his centuries-old vampire bloodline. 3 years dead according to official records, yet here you are claiming pack leadership and making unauthorized territorial agreements. I was never dead, Sarah replied, allowing alpha power to flow through her voice. Merely exiled by circumstances beyond my control. And the Shadowcrest Pack's alliance with Iron Ridge is a military necessity, not a territorial merger requiring council approval. Necessity. The question came from Natasha Frostborn, Alpha of the Northern Territories Pack and Victor's most reliable supporter. What necessity could possibly justify violating established protocols? Sarah exchanged a look with Kieran, who nodded slightly. They discussed this moment, knowing that revealing the truth about the Hunter threat would either galvanize the Council into action or paint targets on both their packs. The necessity of survival, Sarah said simply. The Hunters have developed enhancement technology that allows them to create hybrid soldiers immune to supernatural influence. They're being fed intelligence by someone within our own governing structure. And they've specifically targeted the Blackthorn bloodline because of abilities that could either protect or enslave every supernatural creature on this continent. The silence that followed was deafening. Several council members shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward with sharp interest. Victor's ancient features remained expressionless, but Sarah caught the slight tension around his eyes that suggested her words had hit their mark. These are serious accusations, he said finally. Do you have proof? We have a former hybrid soldier, de-enhanced and cooperative, Kieran said, speaking for the first time since the session began. He's provided intelligence about Hunter operations, enhancement procedures, and the source of their supernatural targeting data. Convenient, Natasha said with obvious skepticism. A witness whose testimony conveniently supports your narrative of external threats requiring emergency pack alliances. Sarah felt her power flare in response to the implied accusation, but Kieran's hand on her arm reminded her to stay calm. Losing her temper in front of the council would only validate their concerns about Blackthorn abilities being dangerous and uncontrolled. Nothing about this situation is convenient, she said instead. The Hunters killed my father through slow poisoning designed to mimic natural weakness. They've spent 3 years tracking my movements, waiting for my abilities to fully manifest. And they're not going to stop with the Shadowcrest Pack. Your father died in legitimate challenge combat, Victor said, his tone carrying centuries of legal precedent. The Iron Ridge Alpha's victory was witnessed by representatives from 3 separate territories. The challenge was legitimate, Kieran agreed, surprising several council members. Marcus Blackthorn accepted my terms according to pack law. But he did so knowing he was already dying, knowing that the only way to protect his daughter was to make her appear powerless and broken. The admission sent ripples of shock through the assembled alphas. Sarah watched their faces, noting who seemed genuinely surprised and who looked like they were hearing confirmation of suspicions they'd already harbored. You're confessing to fraud, Natasha said, her voice sharp with triumph. Conspiracy to circumvent pack law, false territorial claims. I'm confessing to honoring the dying request of a friend who saw threats the rest of us were too blind to acknowledge. Kieran cut her off, his alpha authority crashing against hers in a way that made the video connection crackle with interference. Marcus Blackthorn died protecting secrets that could save or damn us all. I'd rather face council sanctions than explain to the supernatural world why I let those secrets die with him. Before anyone could respond to that declaration, alarms began blaring through the sanctuary's communication center. Thomas's voice cut through the emergency frequencies, multiple contacts approaching from all directions. Hunters, at least 30 vehicles, supported by air assets. This session is concluded, Sarah said, rising from her chair as power crackled around her. Council members who want proof of the Hunter threat are about to get more than they bargained for. She terminated the connection without waiting for responses, her enhanced senses already reaching out to assess the approaching threat. What she found made her blood run cold. Not just human hunters, but supernatural signatures mixed among them. Wolves, vampires, even what felt like fey energy, all moving with coordinated purpose toward the sanctuary. They're not all human, she reported to Kieran, who was already coordinating defensive positions through his own pack bonds.
Some of them are our people.
Turned, controlled, or bought. The hybrid program was just the beginning, Kieran said grimly. They've found ways to compromise supernatural beings directly. Through the sanctuary's windows, Sarah could see pack members taking defensive positions while parents shepherded children toward the most protected areas. 3 hours ago, this had been a place of reunion and hope. Now it was about to become a battlefield. The Grove, she decided. If I can channel the land magic again, amplify it through the bloodline connection. It nearly killed you last time, Kieran reminded her. And that was against a single hybrid. This is an army. Then I guess we'll find out what a Blackthorn mystic can really do when her people are threatened. They ran through the sanctuary together, enhanced speed carrying them past defensive emplacements and toward the sacred heart of the valley. But even as they moved, Sarah's mystical senses detected something that made her stumble with shock. There's another mystic with them, she gasped. Someone with Blackthorn abilities, but wrong somehow. Corrupted. The implications hit them both simultaneously. If the Hunters had captured and turned a member of her bloodline, if they'd found ways to corrupt the very gifts that were supposed to protect supernatural communities. Family reunion, Kieran said with dark humor. Any idea who it might be? Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Distant relatives, cousins who'd inherited diluted versions of the bloodline gifts, anyone who might have escaped notice during the initial purges. But the signature felt familiar in ways that made her stomach churn with recognition. It's not possible, she whispered.
He's dead.
I saw the body. Who, Sarah? My brother. The words came out like broken glass.
Damien.
He died in the original attack on our territory. I saw him fall, saw the silver bullets tear him apart. But even as she spoke, she knew with horrible certainty that the mystical signature approaching through the forest belonged to the brother she'd mourned for 3 years. Damien Blackthorn, risen from the dead and serving the very enemies who destroyed their family. It's a trap, Kieran said, understanding the tactical implications immediately. They're using him to get close to you, to exploit your emotional bonds. Then let's bring it on our terms, Sarah replied, power building around her like a gathering storm. In the grove, where the land itself will fight beside us. They reached the sacred oaks as the first hunter vehicles broke through the sanctuary's outer perimeter. Through her enhanced senses, Sarah felt her people fighting desperately against overwhelming odds. Warriors holding positions that couldn't be held, healers trying to tend wounds faster than they could be inflicted. And walking through the chaos with inhuman calm came a figure she'd thought she'd never see again. Damien Blackthorn looked exactly as she remembered. Dark hair, violet eyes that mirrored her own, the aristocratic features that marked their bloodline. But something fundamental had changed in those eyes, something that made her wolf cower in recognition of a predator wearing a beloved face. Hello, sister, he said, his voice carrying harmonics that shouldn't exist in human speech. Miss me? Behind him came the hybrid soldiers, their enhanced forms moving with coordinated precision, while overhead she could hear the sound of helicopters moving into position. The hunters had brought everything they had, turning the sanctuary into a killing ground designed to eliminate the Blackthorn bloodline once and for all. Damien, Sarah breathed, power and pain warring in her voice. What did they do to you? They gave me purpose, he replied, mystical energy crackling around him in patterns that hurt to look at directly. They showed me what our bloodline could accomplish if we stopped pretending to be protectors and embraced our true nature as apex predators. Our nature is to guard the balance between human and supernatural worlds, Sarah said, drawing on every lesson their father had taught them. To use our gifts responsibly. Responsibility, Damien laughed, and the sound was like breaking crystal. Is that what you call hiding in caves while our people are hunted like animals? Is that what you call watching pack after pack fall to enemies who see us as nothing more than exotic prey? His power lashed out without warning, a psychic assault designed to shatter her mental defenses and leave her helpless before his enhanced abilities. But instead of the easy victory he'd expected, Damien's compulsion met the combined will of two alphas who'd learned to trust each other completely. Kieran's presence in her mind was like an anchor in a psychic storm, his alpha strength reinforcing her own while his memories of protecting her for 3 years formed an unbreakable foundation of trust and growing love. "You're not alone anymore," Kieran said, his hand finding hers as they faced the corrupted brother together. "No," Sarah agreed, power building around them like contained lightning. "I'm not." The battle for the supernatural world's future was about to begin in earnest. And it would be fought not just with claws and silver bullets, but with the very essence of what it meant to be human or monster, protector or predator, family or enemy. The Grove's ancient magic responded to her call, but this time Sarah wasn't fighting for survival. She was fighting for love, for hope, for the possibility that even the deepest corruption could be healed by those willing to pay the price. Even if that price was everything she had left to give. Chapter 10. Blood Moon Rising. The Grove erupted in mystical warfare as brother faced sister in a battle that would determine the fate of every supernatural creature on the continent. Damien's corrupted power lashed out like black lightning, seeking to shatter Sarah's defenses and claim the pure blackthorn abilities she'd inherited. But whereas gifts had been twisted into weapons of domination, hers remained rooted in protection and connection. "You always were the favored child," Damien snarled, his enhanced form rippling with stolen energies. "Father's precious little star, destined to inherit everything while I fought for scraps of attention." "That's not true," Sarah gasped, deflecting another psychic assault while drawing power from the Grove's ancient trees. "Daddy loved us both equally. He was grooming us both to lead. He was grooming you to rule, while I was expected to serve." Damien's voice carried 3 years of accumulated resentment and corruption. "But the hunters showed me a better way. They gave me strength without the burden of protecting weaklings who can't protect themselves." Around them, the larger battle raged as Shadowcrest and Iron Ridge wolves fought desperately against overwhelming odds. Sarah could feel her people falling through the pack bonds, their life forces winking out one by one as silver bullets and enhanced soldiers took their toll. "Sarah?" Thomas's voice cracked through the combat frequencies. "Eastern perimeter is collapsing. We need your power to reinforce the defensive line." But she couldn't abandon the Grove, couldn't let Damien's corruption spread to the sanctuary's heart. If he gained control of the land magic their ancestors had woven into this place, he could turn it into a weapon that would enslave every supernatural creature within 100 miles. "Go," Kieran said, understanding her dilemma instantly. "Help your people. I'll hold him here." "He'll kill you," Sarah protested. "His abilities are enhanced, amplified by whatever the hunters did to him." "Then we'd better finish this quickly." Kieran's wolf erupted from his human form in a display of raw alpha power that shook the ancient oaks. But instead of attacking Damien directly, he placed himself between the corrupted mystic and the Grove's power sources, using his own life force as a shield against the psychic corruption. "How touching," Damien sneered. The great Kieran Steelclaw, reduced to playing bodyguard for his girlfriend. "Tell me, sister, does he know about the compulsion you used on him during your first escape? How you planted suggestions in his mind to make him more amenable to your cause?" The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because it revealed how little her brother understood about the bond she and Kieran had forged. "I never compelled him. I never had to. Everything between us is real." Real. Damien's laugh was like breaking glass. Nothing is real when dealing with our bloodline, Sarah. We are creatures of domination and control, apex predators designed to rule lesser beings. The sooner you accept that truth, the sooner you can join me in building a better world. A world where supernatural creatures are slaves to human masters? Sarah's power flared in response to her rising anger. A world where our gifts are used to oppress instead of protect. A world where we stop pretending to be heroes and embrace what we truly are, monsters with the power to remake reality according to our will. Damien's attack came without warning, not just psychic compulsion but a direct assault on the grove's mystical foundations. Sarah felt him trying to corrupt the land magic itself, to turn 3 centuries of protective enchantments into weapons of enslavement. But he'd underestimated the depth of the bonds connecting her to this place. Every Blackthorn who'd ever practiced their arts in the grove had left traces of their power, their hopes, their desperate desire to protect what they'd built. And all of that accumulated while stood against Damien's corruption like an unbreachable wall. You can't have it, Sarah said, her voice echoing with harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. This place belongs to protectors, not predators. She reached deeper into the grove's power than she'd ever dared before, drawing on not just her own abilities, but the accumulated strength of generations. It was dangerous, potentially fatal, but her people were dying, and she was the only thing standing between them and annihilation. Power flooded through her in torrents that made her previous channeling attempts feel like gentle streams. She felt her ancestors' presence, their knowledge, their absolute conviction that the Blackthorn bloodline existed to serve as guardians rather than tyrants. Impossible, Damien breathed, his corrupted form beginning to waver as pure mystical energy pushed back against his artificial enhancements. The old bloodlines are weak, diluted by generations of restraint and false nobility. The old bloodlines are strong because they're rooted in something greater than personal power, Sarah replied, energy crackling around her like contained starlight. They're rooted in love. She looked at Kieran, who was bleeding from multiple wounds but still standing between her and any threats that might interrupt her channeling. At Thomas and Lydia, who were leading desperate defensive actions despite being outnumbered 3-1. At pack members who'd risked everything to answer her call, who were dying to protect children they'd never met and a future they might not live to see. This is what you never understood, Damien, she continued, power building to levels that made the air itself sing with mystical resonance. Our strength doesn't come from dominating others. It comes from choosing to stand with them. The wave of purification that erupted from the grove swept across the entire sanctuary like a cleansing fire. Hybrid soldiers collapsed as their artificial enhancements were stripped away, leaving behind confused humans who suddenly remembered volunteering for something they didn't understand. Corrupted supernatural creatures found their true natures restored, their minds cleared of whatever compulsions had turned them against their own kind. And Damien himself screamed as 3 years of accumulated corruption burned away under the assault of pure Blackthorn power. Sister, he gasped, his true face emerging from the monstrous facade the hunters had built around him. What did they do to me? I remember agreeing to help them, but not why. There are holes in my memory, places where something else was making decisions for me. They used you, Sarah said gently, though maintaining the purification was draining her strength faster than she could replenish it. Captured you during the first attack, enhanced you with hybrid technology, and used psychic conditioning to make you believe you were choosing to serve them. The pack, Damien's eyes widened with returning clarity. Our people. Are they? Alive, Sarah assured him. Fighting. Winning, now that your corruption isn't amplifying the hunter weapons. Around the sanctuary, the tide of battle was indeed turning. Without their enhanced soldiers and corrupted supernatural allies, the hunter force found itself facing 2 united packs whose alphas could coordinate their efforts through bonds of trust and growing love. I'm sorry, Damien whispered, tears streaming down his face as he fully comprehended what he'd been made to do. The things I said, the people I hurt, were done by someone wearing your face, not by you, Sarah said firmly. the brother I knew would never willingly harm our people. But maintaining the purification field was taking everything she had. Sarah felt her life force being drawn into the mystical working, burning away like fuel in a supernatural fire. She'd saved her brother, saved her people, but the price was going to be her own life. Sarah? Kieran's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she could feel his hands catching her as her legs gave out. You're pushing too hard. You need to stop before I die? She managed a weak smile, even as darkness crept in around the edges of her vision. Worth it. They're safe. You're all safe. Not worth it to me, Kieran said fiercely, his own alpha power flowing into her through their deepening bond. I didn't spend 3 years protecting you just to watch you sacrifice yourself the moment we figured out we love each other. Love. The word hit her like lightning, not because it was unexpected but because hearing it spoken aloud made everything else seem suddenly clear and simple. I love you too, she whispered, drawing strength from his presence even as her mystical abilities reached their absolute limit. That's why I have to. That's why we do this together, he interrupted, his power joining with hers in a way that defied every law of supernatural genetics she'd ever learned. Alphas weren't supposed to be able to share mystical abilities. Pack bonds didn't work that way. But somehow, impossibly, Kieran's strength was flowing into her working, stabilizing the purification field while preventing it from consuming her entirely. How? She gasped. Love, he said simply. Turns out it really can work miracles. Together, they finished the cleansing of the sanctuary, driving out the last traces of corruption while establishing protections that would prevent future infiltration. The hunter force retreated in chaos, their technology useless against pure mystical power, and their hybrid soldiers reduced to confused humans who no longer remembered why they'd come to this remote valley. As the immediate threat faded, Sarah became aware of new presences approaching the sanctuary, council members arriving in person, drawn by reports of the battle and its impossible outcome. Well, she said, leaning against Kieran's solid warmth as her strength slowly returned. I think we're about to have some very interesting political conversations. Let them come, Kieran replied, his arms tightening around her protectively. After what we've accomplished here, I think the supernatural world is ready for some changes in leadership. Through the pack bonds, Sarah felt her people's emotions, relief, pride, hope for a future that no longer required hiding or running. They'd won more than just a battle. They'd proven that unity was stronger than division, that love could triumph over corruption, that the old ways of protection and service were worth preserving. So what happens now? Damien asked, approaching hesitantly. His corruption was gone, but the guilt over what he'd been forced to do still weighed heavily on his shoulders. Now we rebuild, Sarah said, looking around the sanctuary that had become the birthplace of a new era. We hunt down the remaining hunter cells, root out any other corruption in the supernatural government, and make sure something like this never happens again. Together? Kieran asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Together, Sarah confirmed, rising on her toes to kiss the man who'd been her enemy, her protector, and finally her partner in reshaping the world. The blood moon was setting beyond the mountains, its red light giving way to the silver illumination of ordinary moonlight. The war for the supernatural world's future was far from over, but for the first time in years, victory seemed not just possible but inevitable. After all, they had love on their side. And as any Blackthorn mystic could tell you, Chapter 11, Crown of Stars. The emergency council session convened at dawn in the sanctuary's Great Hall, but this time Victor Drakemore and his fellow council members were physically present, their expressions ranging from calculating interest to barely concealed alarm. Word of the night's events had spread through supernatural channels faster than wildfire. A Blackthorn mystic had awakened, the Hunter Enhancement Program had been exposed, and 2 of the continent's most powerful packs had formally united under joint leadership. Sarah sat at the head of the ancient oak table, Kieran beside her in a show of unified authority that made several council members shift uncomfortably. Behind them stood the survivors of the night's battle, wolves bearing fresh scars and silver burns, but their eyes blazing with the confidence of people who'd faced annihilation and emerged victorious. "The floor recognizes Seraphina Blackthorn," Victor said with careful formality, though his ancient vampire senses were clearly cataloging the mystical energies still crackling around her. "You've requested this emergency session to address irregularities in council oversight of pack territories." "Irregularities," Sarah repeated, allowing a hint of her newfound power to color her voice. "Is that what we're calling treason now?" The accusation hit the assembled council like a physical blow. Several members started to protest, but Sarah raised her hand for silence, and the gesture carried enough mystical weight to compel obedience from even the most powerful supernatural politicians. "Someone in this room has been feeding intelligence to the hunters," she continued, her enhanced senses probing each council member for signs of guilt or deception. "Pack locations, bloodline records, territorial agreements, information that could only come from council-level access to our databases." "These are serious charges," Natasha Frostborn said, though her usual confidence seemed strained. "Do you have evidence to support?" "I have a confession," Damien interrupted, stepping forward from where he'd been standing with the other survivors. 3 days ago, while still under hunter conditioning, I accessed council servers using credentials provided by someone calling themselves Shadow Friend. I downloaded pack records for 17 territories, including detailed bloodline analyses for every major Alpha family. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah watched the council members' faces, noting who looked genuinely shocked and who seemed to be calculating damage control strategies. "The credentials were legitimate," Damien continued, "embedded with authorization codes that could only come from a sitting council member with full database access." "Impossible," Victor said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Our security protocols are designed to prevent external infiltration, not internal betrayal," Kieran interrupted. "Someone with legitimate access could bypass those safeguards easily." Sarah's mystical senses were painting a clearer picture with each passing moment. Most of the council members radiated genuine confusion and alarm, but 2 signatures stood out, one carrying the metallic taste of fear and guilt, the other blazing with protective fury that felt like righteous anger. "Marcus Stormwind," she said, focusing on the first signature. "Alpha of the Eastern Seaboard Pack. Your emotional resonance suggests you have something to share with the group." The silver-haired Alpha went rigid, his weathered face cycling through expressions of denial, calculation, and finally resignation. "You can't prove anything." "I don't need to prove it," Sarah replied calmly. "Your guilt is written in every line of your psychic signature. The question is why. What did the hunters offer you that was worth betraying your own people?" Marcus's composure cracked entirely. "They had my daughter," he whispered. "My youngest girl, captured during a raid on our summer gathering. They said they'd kill her if I didn't cooperate." The admission sent shockwaves through the assembled council. Sarah felt a moment of genuine sympathy for the broken Alpha. She understood the lengths a parent would go to protect their child, but that sympathy was tempered by the knowledge of how many wolves had died because of his betrayal. "The intelligence you provided led to the deaths of over 300 supernatural creatures," she said quietly. "Pack members who trusted you to protect them, children who never had the chance to grow up, elders who carried centuries of wisdom that died with them." "I know." Marcus broke down completely, tears streaming down his scarred face. "I know what I've done. But she's my little girl. I couldn't let them hurt her." "And where is your daughter now?" Kieran asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Dead," Marcus whispered. "They killed her anyway, the moment the last intelligence package was delivered. Said she'd served her purpose and was no longer useful leverage." The council erupted in angry voices and accusations, but Sarah's attention was focused on the second anomalous signature she detected. The protective fury that felt like righteous anger was coming from someone who'd been watching this entire exchange with barely contained violence. "Elena Ravencrest," she said, and Kieran's former healer looked up with eyes that blazed with supernatural fire. "You're not just angry about Marcus's betrayal. You're angry because you've been hunting the traitor for months." Elena nodded grimly. Pack healers talk to each other across territorial boundaries. We share information about unusual injuries, new threats, medical developments. For the past year, I've been tracking a pattern of attacks that suggested someone with high-level intelligence access was feeding information to hostile forces. Why didn't you bring this to the council? Victor demanded. Because I wasn't sure who could be trusted, Elena replied. The intelligence leaks were too precise, too well-timed. It had to be someone with regular access to council databases and territorial planning sessions. Sarah felt the political currents shifting around the table as council members began to realize the implications. If one alpha could be compromised through personal leverage, how many others might be vulnerable to similar pressure? This changes everything, she said, standing to address the assembled leaders. The hunters aren't just external enemies anymore. They're inside our government, our families, our most trusted institutions. Traditional pack politics and territorial boundaries won't protect us from that kind of infiltration. What are you proposing? Victor asked, though his ancient eyes suggested he already suspected where this was heading. A new structure, Sarah replied, mystical power crackling around her like contained lightning. A unified command structure that can coordinate responses across territorial boundaries. An organization with the authority to root out corruption wherever it's found, regardless of pack politics or traditional hierarchies. You're talking about revolution, Natasha said, her voice tight with alarm. I'm talking about evolution, Sarah corrected. The supernatural world has changed. Our enemies have changed. We need to change too, or we'll be hunted into extinction by creatures who understand adaptation better than we do. She gestured toward the sanctuary's windows, where the morning sun was illuminating a valley that had been transformed overnight. Pack members from different territories were working together to repair battle damage, sharing resources and expertise without regard for traditional boundaries. Look at what we accomplished in a single night, she continued. 2 packs working as one, coordinating their strengths instead of competing for dominance. We saved my brother from corruption, defeated an enhanced hunter force, and proved that unity makes us stronger than any individual territory could be alone. And you want to extend that unity across the entire continent, Victor said thoughtfully. A supernatural confederation with centralized leadership and standardized protocols for dealing with external threats. With you and Steelclaw as the supreme commanders, naturally, Natasha added with obvious skepticism. Sarah exchanged a look with Kieran, some silent communication passing between them. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of decisions made in the crucible of battle and sealed with bonds stronger than pack law. With whoever proves capable of protecting our people, she said simply. Leadership should be earned through service, not inherited through bloodlines or seized through conquest. Pretty words, Marcus said bitterly from where he sat in disgrace. But power corrupts, regardless of how it's obtained. Your Blackthorn abilities make you more dangerous than any traditional alpha. What happens when you decide that our resistance to your plans justifies using compulsion to ensure compliance? The challenge hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Sarah felt the weight of every gaze in the room, the knowledge that her response would shape how the supernatural world viewed her for generations to come. Then you do what you should have done the moment you suspected I might abuse my power, she said quietly. You stop me. By whatever means necessary. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small silver pendant, a family heirloom that had been passed down through generations of Blackthorn mystical practitioners. This is a power focus, she explained, placing it on the table where everyone could see it. It amplifies mystical abilities while providing a direct link to the wielder's mental state. Any qualified mage can use it to monitor my thoughts, detect compulsion attempts, even override my abilities if I'm compromised. The pendant's significance wasn't lost on the assembled council members. Sarah was offering to submit to constant surveillance, to accept limitations on her most powerful abilities, in exchange for the authority to protect supernatural communities from external threats. You're proposing to put your own power under external oversight, Victor said, clearly intrigued despite his careful neutrality. To accept constraints that could be used against you by political enemies. I'm proposing to prove that the Blackthorn bloodline exists to serve our people, not rule them, Sarah replied. My ancestors fought wars to establish that principle. I'm willing to risk everything to preserve it. Kieran's hand found hers on the table, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that spoke of partnership and shared risk. As am I, he said. The Iron Ridge Pact stands with Shadowcrest in this proposal. Our resources, our territory, our lives, all dedicated to protecting supernatural communities from the threats that traditional pack politics can't address. The vote, when it came, wasn't unanimous. Several council members abstained, and Natasha cast the sole dissenting ballot, but it was decisive enough to authorize the formation of a new Continental Supernatural Defense Coalition. As the council members departed to inform their respective territories of the historic decision, Sarah remained at the oak table with Kieran, suddenly exhausted by the weight of what they'd committed to. Second thoughts, he asked, echoing Lydia's question from what felt like a lifetime ago. About taking on responsibility for every supernatural creature on the continent? Absolutely. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. About doing it with you? Never. His arm came around her waist, pulling her closer as they watched the sun climb higher over the sanctuary that had become the birthplace of a new era. So, what happens now?
Kieran asked.
Now we prove that love really can change the world, Sarah replied, turning in his arms to face the man who'd been her enemy, her protector, and finally her partner in reshaping the supernatural world's future. Outside, the pack bonds were singing with hope and determination as wolves from different territories worked together to build something better than what they'd inherited. The revolution had begun, and it was founded on the simple truth that sometimes the strongest bonds were forged not in blood or conquest, but in the choice to stand together against the darkness. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as one. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to tip the balance toward a future where love conquered fear, unity defeated division, and the supernatural world could finally step out of the shadows without shame. The crown of stars was rising, and Sarah intended to wear it not as a symbol of dominion, but as a promise of protection for all who chose to follow. Chapter 12. Heart of the Storm. 6 months after the Battle of Shadowcrest Sanctuary, Sarah stood on the balcony of the Coalition's new headquarters, watching the sun set over a world that had changed beyond recognition. Below, supernatural creatures from dozens of territories worked together in what had once been the abandoned ruins of a human military base, now transformed into a bustling center of interspecies cooperation. Vampires coordinated intelligence networks with werewolf scouts. Fae technicians enhanced communication systems with crystalline magic. Even representatives from the notoriously reclusive dragon clans had agreed to participate in the Coalition's defensive planning sessions. Admiring your empire? Kieran's voice carried affectionate amusement as he joined her on the balcony, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in his hands. Hardly an empire, Sarah replied, accepting the warmth gratefully. More like organized chaos with good intentions. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of political negotiations, military reorganization, and the delicate work of building trust between supernatural communities that had spent centuries maintaining careful distance from each other. Not every pack had joined the coalition willingly. Some had required convincing through demonstrations of the new organization's effectiveness in hunting down hunter cells and eliminating hybrid enhancement labs. The Western Territories report came in, Kieran said, settling beside her against the railing. 3 more hunter facilities dismantled, 47 hybrids successfully de-enhanced and returned to their families. Any resistance from local pack leadership?
None.
Turns out having your territory cleansed of hostile infiltrators is something most alphas can appreciate, regardless of their feelings about centralized authority. Sarah nodded, though part of her attention was focused on the mystical energies flowing through the Coalition headquarters. The silver pendant she wore, the power focus that allowed constant monitoring of her abilities, had become as natural as breathing, its presence a reminder that her gifts belonged to the supernatural world rather than herself. Elena's latest medical report shows no signs of mystical corruption or compulsion usage, Kieran continued, reading her thoughts with the ease of 6 months' worth of deepening bonds. The Council Oversight Committee is satisfied that you're not secretly mind-controlling world leaders. Yet, Sarah said with dark humor, give them time to find something new to worry about. The political challenges had been expected. Supernatural communities didn't abandon centuries of independence easily, and the coalition's authority required constant proof of its legitimacy. But the personal challenges had been more surprising. Learning to love someone while simultaneously building a new world order had required navigation skills neither of them possessed. They'd had their first real fight over resource allocation policies. Their second had been about whether Sarah's diplomatic immunity extended to unauthorized raids on suspected hunter facilities. Their third had been about Kieran's tendency to make unilateral decisions when he thought she was pushing herself too hard. All of which had ended with passionate reconciliations that left them both grateful for soundproof office walls. The full moon gathering is tomorrow, Kieran said, his voice carrying undertones that made Sarah's pulse quicken. All coalition members present. Formal ceremony to mark the 6-month anniversary of our founding. And to address the question the Council has been politely avoiding for months, Sarah added. The question of what happened when two alphas from different territories formed a permanent bond. Traditional pack law had no provisions for shared leadership between equals, especially when one of them possessed mystical abilities that could theoretically override any opposition to their authority. They want us to formalize the relationship, Kieran said. Make it official in ways that satisfy both supernatural law and coalition governance requirements. They want to make sure we're not just playing politics with our personal lives, Sarah translated. That this isn't some elaborate power grab disguised as romance. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. For 3 years, they'd maintained the fiction of enmity to protect her from forces that wanted to use her abilities. Now they were being asked to prove that their love was real rather than politically convenient. There's another option, Kieran said carefully. We could keep things as they are. Maintain professional partnership without formalizing the personal relationship. It would be easier politically, less ammunition for critics who think we're concentrating too much power. Sarah turned to study his face, noting the careful neutrality that meant he was offering her an out while hoping desperately that she wouldn't take it. 6 months of working together had taught her to read the subtle tells that revealed his true feelings beneath the alpha mask. Is that what you want? She asked. I want whatever keeps you safe and makes you happy, he replied. If formalizing our bond puts a target on your back or creates political pressure that interferes with the coalition's work. Kieran. She set down her coffee and turned to face him fully. What do you want? Not what's politically expedient or strategically sound. What does your heart want? For a moment, the alpha mask slipped entirely, revealing the man beneath. Someone who'd sacrificed everything to honor a promise, who'd let himself be hated to keep her safe, who discovered that love really could change the world if you were willing to pay the price. I want to wake up beside you every morning for the rest of our lives, he said quietly. I want the right to call you mine in front of the entire supernatural world. I want to build something lasting together, not just politically but personally. Then that's what we'll do, Sarah said simply. Politics be damned. She reached for the silver pendant around her neck, the power focus that had become both symbol and safeguard of her commitment to serving rather than ruling. With careful deliberation, she lifted it over her head and placed it in Kieran's hands. Will you accept this bond? She asked, using the formal words that had sealed alpha partnerships for 1,000 years. Will you share the burden of leadership and the blessing of power, standing as my equal in all things until death claims us both? The pendant began to glow in Kieran's hands, responding to the mystical energies flowing between them. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute commitment. I accept, he said, and I offer the same bond in return. My strength as your strength, my protection as your protection, my love as the foundation upon which we'll build our shared future. The moment their hands touched around the pendant, Sarah felt the world shift in fundamental ways. The power focus expanded to encompass both of them, creating a mystical link that went beyond traditional pack bonds or political alliances. She could feel Kieran's emotions as if they were her own, could sense his thoughts and intentions with perfect clarity. And more importantly, she could feel his absolute trust in her judgment, his unwavering faith that she would never use her abilities to harm him or manipulate their relationship. "Well," she said, marveling at the completeness of their connection. "That was unexpectedly intense." The pendant is designed to facilitate true partnerships between mystical practitioners, Kieran explained, though his voice was slightly hoarse with emotion. It creates absolute transparency between bonded pairs, making deception or compulsion impossible. No secrets, Sarah realized. No hidden agendas or political calculations. Just truth. Just truth, he agreed, pulling her closer until they were sharing breath. "Are you ready for that level of honesty?" Instead of answering with words, Sarah kissed him with all the passion and hope and desperate love that 6 months of building a new world together had created. Through their new bond, she felt his response, joy and relief and the bone-deep satisfaction of finally being able to love her without reservation or fear. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the mystical energies around them were singing with harmonics that spoke of permanent, unbreakable connection. "So," Kieran said, his forehead resting against hers, "tomorrow we announce our formal bonding to the full coalition assembly, deal with whatever political fallout results, and continue the work of reforming supernatural governance across the continent." "And tonight?" Sarah asked, her pulse quickening at the heat in his amber eyes. "Tonight, we celebrate the fact that sometimes enemies really can become lovers, especially when they discover they were never really enemies in the first place." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared overhead, Sarah allowed herself to be led inside by the man who'd been her protector, her partner, and finally her soulmate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were still hunter cells to eliminate, corrupted officials to expose, and the delicate work of building trust between supernatural communities that had spent centuries in isolation. But tonight belonged to them alone. Tonight was for celebrating the miracle of love discovered in the midst of war, for exploring the depths of a bond that went beyond politics or power, for building the personal foundation that would support whatever challenges the future might bring. 6 months ago, Sarah had been a refugee planning sabotage against an enemy who turned out to be her greatest ally. Now she was a leader building a better world alongside the man who'd proven that sometimes the most powerful magic of all was the choice to trust, to love, to stand together against the darkness. The blood moon had set long ago, but the stars were rising bright and eternal over a world where supernatural creatures no longer had to hide in the shadows. Where love had conquered hatred, unity had defeated division, and 2 enemies had discovered that the strongest bonds were forged not in conquest, but in the choice to protect what they held dear. The revolution was complete. The future stretched ahead, bright with possibility. And in the heart of it all, a Blackthorn mystic and an Ironridge Alpha proved that sometimes the most radical act of all was simply choosing to love without reservation, to trust without limit, and to build something beautiful from the ashes of what came before. The war was over. Love had won. And they were just getting started.
The end.